I feel it first in the marble, a subtle vibration beneath my fingers as I trace the columns fluting outside the Lyceum this morning. Most would dismiss it as imagination, or perhaps attribute it to distant quarrying beyond the city walls. But I have spent too many years studying the language of the cosmos not to recognize the whispers of change. The tremor is not in the stone, but in time itself. Athens stands magnificent in the golden light of early autumn, seemingly eternal, yet I sense the first hairline fractures forming in our certainty. I am Aristodemus of Athens, though many know me simply as a student of Aristotle's student. A keeper of methods more than originator of ideas. For 30 years, I have taught rhetoric and natural philosophy, examining arguments as meticulously as physicians inspect organs for signs of disorder. My reputation, while respected, remains modest, which affords me the freedom to observe, without the burden of defending an exalted legacy. Perhaps this is why I see what my more illustrious colleagues cannot or will not acknowledge. The agora was unusually subdued today. The merchants called their wares with the same practiced enthusiasm. Politicians still gathered with their circles of admirers beneath the plane trees, and the fishmongers argued with customary vigor over the morning's catch. Yet beneath this familiar symphony, a subtle dissonance plays, conversations that halt too abruptly when certain subjects arise, glances that betray anxiety beneath practiced smiles, a collective tension that reminds me of animals before an earthquake. A philosopher should attend to what is, not what might be, Cleanthes admonished when I mentioned my unease during our morning walk. He is not wrong, according to the Stoic principles he espouses. Yet I find myself increasingly drawn to the margins of scrolls rather than their centers, to the implications that lurk between carefully constructed syllogisms. History teaches us that civilizations, like arguments, often reveal their flaws at the edges first. I observed a curious scene while crossing the agora. A merchant from Syracuse, displaying fabrics of remarkable quality, was engaged in heated negotiation with Lysimachus, who oversees the import tariffs. Their dispute was common enough, the proper assessment of luxury goods, but their words contained undercurrents that caught my attention. These levies strangle trade more each season, the Syracusan complained, loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. In Antioch, they welcome merchants with incentives rather than extracting ever more drachmae from diminishing commerce. Antioch lacks our cultural refinement, Lysimachus replied, with practiced disdain. Athens remains the intellectual center of the world, regardless of shifting trade routes. Men cannot eat intellectual refinement, the merchant countered, lowering his voice as he leaned closer. And I have visited your academy recently. 3 of the chairs stand empty, their occupants lured to Alexandria by Ptolemy's generous patronage. Even wisdom flows toward prosperity. Lysimachus had no response beyond bureaucratic indignation. I lingered, pretending interest in nearby pottery, and noted how the surrounding Athenians reacted, not with outrage at the merchant's impudence but with uncomfortable recognition. When I was a youth, such a comment would have provoked immediate defense of Athenian superiority. Now it produces only the strained silence of a truth acknowledged but unaddressed. Later, in my garden where I sometimes teach a small circle of dedicated students, young Theocritus raised a question that pierced me like a well-aimed spear. We had been discussing Heraclitus and his notion that one cannot step into the same river twice. "Master Aristodemus?" he asked, earnest eyes belying his intent. If wisdom itself flows like Heraclitus's river, might Athens now stand on the shores of a diminishing stream? The waters of knowledge that once rushed through our city seem to turn increasingly toward other banks. The other students shifted uncomfortably, as questioning Athens' intellectual primacy borders on impiety. I should have offered reassurance, reminded them of our glorious philosophical lineage from Socrates through Plato and Aristotle. Instead, I found myself responding with uncharacteristic candor. The nature of streams, I said carefully, is that They follow the path of least resistance, carving new channels when old ones become obstructed. Perhaps we should consider whether we have placed too many stones in wisdom's path. Theocritus nodded, while several others looked troubled. Only Calliope, my most promising student, seemed to truly understand. Then we should become more like water ourselves, she suggested, rather than stones resisting its inevitable flow. The discussion moved to safer topics, but the question lingered in the air like the scent of approaching rain. After my students departed, I remained in the garden until dusk, watching shadows lengthen across marble that has stood for generations. How strange that something so solid could appear suddenly fragile in the fading light. This evening, I received a letter from my old friend Philodemus, who left Athens 15 years ago to establish himself in Rome. His correspondence typically focuses on philosophical matters or humorous observations about Roman attempts to appropriate Greek culture. Today's message struck a different tone. Athens remains the beloved mother of my mind, but Rome is undeniably the father of the future. What Rome lacks in original thought, it compensates for in remarkable pragmatism. They build not just with stone, but with an inevitability that both admires and devours what we Greeks have created. They do not wish to replace our civilization, but to absorb it, which may prove a more complete conquest than any achieved through arms alone. I find myself unable to dismiss his words as the justifications of an expatriate. Philodemus sees Athens from the perspective of distance, perhaps perceiving contours invisible to those of us still walking her daily streets. The Romans I have met strike me as practical men, limited in philosophical depth yet possessed of a certain relentless vision we increasingly lack. The oil in my lamp burns low as I write these reflections. Outside, the night chorus of Athens continues. Symposia in wealthy homes, laughter from taverns, the occasional argument or declaration of drunken wisdom. The city breathes with familiar rhythms that should reassure me. Yet I cannot shake the sensation of living in two moments simultaneously, the vibrant present and some future time when these sounds exist only as echoes in crumbling ruins. Tomorrow I will visit the temple of Athena and make offerings for the city's continued prosperity. Faith in our divine patroness has protected Athens through many trials, but even as I prepare the traditional honey cake for this ritual, I wonder, do the gods themselves sometimes withdraw their favor when cities begin to hollow from within? Or is divine abandonment merely the name we give to our own collective failures of wisdom and foresight? The tremor I felt this morning in the marble was subtle. Perhaps nothing more than the physical manifestation of my own anxiety. Yet a lifetime of philosophical inquiry has taught me that wisdom begins with acknowledging uncomfortable perceptions rather than dismissing them. I will watch, listen, and record what I observe in these uncertain days. If the foundations of our city-state are indeed beginning to shift, perhaps these humble observations will someday help others understand how even the greatest of civilizations first begins to waver. The symposium at Lysander's villa began like countless others I have attended over 3 decades. The customary rituals observed, garlands distributed, the first libation poured to Dionysus. Yet something in the quality of light from the oil lamps seemed different tonight, casting longer shadows behind each guest as we reclined on couches arranged in the traditional pie formation. Perhaps it was merely my perception, already tinted by unease after yesterday's observations. Lysander himself has changed since his return from diplomatic service in Egypt. Once an ardent defender of Athenian superiority in all matters, he now decorates his andron with Egyptian curiosities and occasionally drops Alexandrian expressions into his speech. Tonight, he uncorked amphorae of wine from Rhodes, Chios, and even Italy. A tacit acknowledgement that Athens no longer produces the finest of everything. To Athens eternal, he offered as the opening toast, traditional enough. Yet I detected a subtle questioning lilt at the end, transforming statement into something almost interrogative. Around the room, 12 distinguished men, Philosophers, playwrights, merchants, and one retired general raised their kylix cups with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The first hour maintained appropriate dignity, discussion of recent theatrical performances, moderate complaints about taxation, gentle intellectual sparring about the relative merits of competing philosophical schools. But as the wine steward made his third round, diluting the wine less each time according to Lysander's instruction, the conversation began its inevitable descent from the head to the heart, from measured discourse to something more revealing. "I sold my fishing fleet last month," announced Demochares abruptly, interrupting a meandering debate about Epicurean ethics. As one of Athens' wealthier merchants, his business decisions carried significance beyond his personal fortunes. "Surely, not all your vessels?" inquired Sophocles the Younger, whose mediocre plays receive more generous treatment than they deserve, due to his family's financial influence. "Every last hull," Demochares confirmed, swirling wine that reflected lamplight like liquid garnets. "I have reinvested in Egyptian grain futures and warehouses in Rhodes." A momentary silence settled over the gathering. Such a complete divestment from Athenian maritime interests by one of our prominent citizens carried implications none wished to voice directly. "A shrewd diversification," offered Antigonus, breaking the tension with practiced diplomatic skill. "Though surely Athens' position remains central to Eastern Mediterranean commerce?" Demochares' laugh contained no mirth. "Athens' position remains central only in Athenian imaginations. Our harbor at Piraeus now receives half the vessels it welcomed during my father's time. Meanwhile, Alexandria expands its port again, their third expansion in 20 years, and Rhodes captures more of the lucrative eastern trade each season." "Trade fluctuates cyclically," countered Hegesippus, who teaches economics with dogmatic certainty. "Athens has weathered commercial declines before." "Indeed," Demochares nodded, his expression softening with wine and something like pity. "Just as the human body recovers from multiple illnesses throughout life, until the final one from which it does not." The symposiarch, recognizing dangerous currents, attempted to direct conversation toward the upcoming dramatic festival. But Cleanthes, the Stoic with whom I had walked yesterday morning, surprisingly steered us back to troubled waters. "We speak comforting falsehoods in the agora," he said, "then drown uncomfortable truths in wine at night. Neither approach serves wisdom." He turned to Demochares with unexpected directness. "You divested from Athenian shipping not merely because of declining trade volumes, but because our naval protection has grown unreliable. State it plainly." Nicanor, the retired general who had commanded our fleet a decade ago, placed his cup down with deliberate control. "Our triremes remain the best designed in the Mediterranean," he said, military pride evident in his posture. Then, unexpectedly, his shoulders slumped. "But we can now crew barely 30 vessels effectively, when once we sailed hundreds." "The economic constraints are temporary," Hegesippus insisted. "After the recent conflicts—" "It is not merely economic," Nicanor interrupted, the wine having eroded his typical martial reserve. "It is demographic and spiritual. We lack not only funds, but young men willing to row and soldiers who believe in what they defend. My successor complains that our finest youth now pursue rhetoric or commerce rather than military excellence. Those who do serve increasingly do so as mercenaries, fighting for pay rather than patriotic principle." "Perhaps they have grown wiser than their fathers," suggested Epicrates with a sardonic smile. "They calculate the rewards differently." "A city that outsources its defense court submission," Nicanor replied quietly. "I say this not in public forums, where such talk damages already fragile morale, but here among friends. Athens can no longer defend herself without allies we increasingly cannot afford." The admission hung in the air, more shocking for coming from a man who had dedicated his life to Athenian military power. In response, cups were emptied and promptly refilled. "We still possess what truly matters," declared Sophocles the Younger, with theatrical flourish. Athens remains the intellectual beacon of the civilized world. Our philosophical schools attract the finest minds from across the Mediterranean. Our artistic and cultural achievements. Half my students now come from Rome, interrupted Apollodorus, who teaches rhetoric to the sons of wealthy families. They arrive with purses full of gold and heads full of practical ambition. They absorb our knowledge not with reverence, but with the calculating air of men cataloging acquisitions. Roman gold spends as well as any, shrugged Epicrates, until they decide they no longer need the source, countered Apollodorus. They extract our intellectual resources as methodically as they extract silver from conquered mines. These students return to Rome carrying Athens in their minds, establishing their own schools taught by Greek tutors lured with substantial salaries. Each year, more of my former pupils write that they're quite comfortable in Rome, thank you, with no intention of returning. I had remained largely silent, observing more than participating, but now found myself asking, has enrollment in the academy and lyceum truly declined as rumored? Glances exchanged around the room confirmed the uncomfortable truth before anyone spoke. The academy operates at half its capacity compared to 20 years ago, acknowledged Theo, who serves on its administrative council. We maintain appearances, of course. The buildings remain impressive, selected public lectures are well attended, and our reputation still draws sufficient students to continue operations. But 3 teaching chairs remain vacant because we cannot match Alexandria's offerings, and our research facilities grow increasingly inadequate compared to the mouseion that Ptolemy has established. Knowledge, like water, flows toward those who value it enough to invest properly, observed Cleanthes. We praise Athens as wisdom's home while reducing funding for its institutions. Perhaps wisdom itself evolves beyond our traditional forms, suggested Lysander, revealing how his time in Egypt had transformed his thinking. The mouseion approaches knowledge differently. More systematic collection, more practical application, more integration of diverse traditions. More foreign contamination of pure Greek thought, you mean, retorted Hegesippus. There is no pure Greek thought, Lysander replied with the confidence of a man who has seen more of the world. Our greatest insights built upon Egyptian mathematics, Babylonian astronomy, Phoenician navigation, Persian administrative systems. Athens flourished by synthesizing and improving, not by intellectual isolation. The conversation fractured then into smaller exchanges, some passionate defenses of Athenian exceptionalism, others sober assessments of diminishing influence. I found myself in conversation with Nicanor, the retired general, whose military perspective offered unexpected clarity. Civilizations don't collapse dramatically, he confided, leaning closer to avoid being overheard. They recede gradually, like a tide that withdraws so slowly few notice until the harbor stands dry. I've studied the patterns, Mycenaean collapse, Minoan decline, the fading of once dominant cities. The outward structures remain impressive while the internal vigor dissipates. We maintain the appearance of greatness even as its substance leaks away. As the evening progressed toward its inevitable dissolution, some guests growing philosophical, others argumentative, a few succumbing to wine-induced slumber, I observed how differently these men spoke here compared to their public pronouncements. The same individuals who confidently proclaimed Athens' eternal primacy in council meetings and public assemblies now voiced doubts they would vehemently deny expressing should they be quoted tomorrow. Wine reveals truths, the old saying goes. Perhaps more accurately, wine temporarily dissolves the boundary between what we know privately and what we proclaim publicly. As symposiasts, we momentarily inhabit a shadow realm where uncomfortable recognitions can be voiced without immediate consequence, only to be conveniently forgotten with morning sobriety. Walking home through moonlit streets, I found myself wondering how many similar conversations occurred throughout Athens each night. How many momentary recognitions of decline were drowned in wine before dawn could cement them into civic action. The pattern seemed to mirror Athens herself. A city, brilliant in philosophy, yet increasingly unable to apply wisdom to its own circumstances, capable of analyzing the downfall of distant states while ignoring the structural weaknesses in our own foundations. Tomorrow these men will resume their public personas, speaking confidently of Athenian superiority while privately rearranging their investments toward more promising shores. I too will don the expected mantle of intellectual certainty when teaching, though my convictions grow increasingly tinted with doubt. Perhaps this gap between private recognition and public proclamation itself constitutes a symptom of civilizational decline, when a society can no longer speak honestly about its condition, even to itself. We who pride ourselves on philosophical truth-seeking now practice a curious compartmentalization, analyzing reality precisely in our symposia, while carefully maintaining comfortable illusions in our assemblies. The tremors I felt yesterday in marble continue in the realm of discourse, subtle vibrations between what we know and what we say, hairline fractures in our collective narrative about ourselves. I wonder how long such divisions can persist before the structure itself begins to visibly crack. Today I abandoned the shaded colonnades favored by philosophers to spend long hours in the marketplace, moving among the common citizens of Athens. We thinkers often mistake our specialized discourse for the pulse of the city, failing to recognize that truth sometimes speaks more clearly through the fishmonger's complaints than the philosopher's syllogisms. As Socrates himself recognized, wisdom begins in the agora, not merely in the academy. Dawn had barely broken when I arrived. The marketplace awakens earlier than the philosophical schools, animated by practical necessity rather than intellectual curiosity. Farmers arranged produce still carrying morning dew. Fishermen displayed catches that occasionally still gasped for water. Merchants unpacked wares carried by donkeys that brayed complaints about their burdens. This daily resurrection of commerce has changed little in outward form since my youth, yet subtle differences reveal themselves to patient observation. I paused near Myrto's vegetable stall, where she has sold garden produce for 20 years. Her once abundant display has contracted noticeably, the variety diminished. When I inquired about the magnificent celery root she once specialized in growing, her weathered face tightened. "The water, philosopher," she said, recognizing me from occasional purchases. "The public irrigation channels to our growing fields work poorly now. The maintenance has lapsed. Those who can afford private water access still grow abundant crops, but small farmers like me must choose fewer plants or insufficient water for all. Either way, we produce less." "Surely the magistrates address such basic infrastructure?" I asked. Her laugh held the particular bitterness of the practically minded confronting institutional failure. "They speak eloquently of addressing it. Meanwhile, my son carries water in clay pots from the Ilissos River before dawn each day, because speech repairs nothing without action behind it." Moving deeper into the market, I noticed other signs invisible from the philosophical quarter. More stalls than I recalled stood empty, particularly those that once sold luxury goods. Of those still operating, many now displayed cheaper imported wares rather than Athenian craftsmanship. Near the bronze workers section, two artisans argued loudly with a customer over prices. "3 years ago, you charged 20 drachmae for similar work," insisted the well-dressed patron. "3 years ago, we could obtain Laurian silver without extortionate taxes," countered the craftsman. "3 years ago, my 4 apprentices hadn't departed for Antioch, where their skills command higher wages." "Perhaps I'll commission the piece in Corinth, then," the customer threatened. The bronze worker's response proved unexpectedly philosophical. "Athens will soon excel only in producing complaints about what Athens no longer produces." By midday, the marketplace thronged with citizens from every social stratum. I seated myself near the public fountain, where conversations flow as freely as water. 2 women drawing water spoke without noticing my presence. My son's tutor demands higher payment again, complained the younger woman. I told him we cannot afford another increase. Perhaps engage one of the new foreign teachers, suggested her companion. Many have arrived recently. Syrians, Egyptians, even a few Romans. They charge less than native Athenian instructors. But their Greek is sometimes better than our own. The older woman laughed. My neighbor's children study with a man from Rhodes who quotes Homer more beautifully than any Athenian I've heard. Our city no longer holds exclusive claim to cultural refinement, though we cling to that belief like a widow to her husband's cloak. This casual observation from an ordinary citizen contained more honest assessment than I'd heard in countless academic debates about Athenian cultural superiority. Throughout the agora, similar conversations revealed awareness of decline typically absent from official discourse. The people who maintain daily existence through practical work recognize shifts that we philosophers sometimes obscure with theoretical complications. Near the foreign merchants section, I observed another telling scene. A group of visiting traders from Syria displayed remarkable textiles dyed in colors once exclusive to Athenian workshops. Their prices undercut local producers significantly. When the market overseer inspected their goods for the quality certification required of all merchandise, an exchange followed that illuminated our changing position. These exceed Athenian quality standards, the Syrian merchant argued confidently. In previous years, your inspections maintained the highest standards in the Mediterranean. Now they merely protect declining local industries from superior competition. Rather than displaying offended patriotism, the Athenian official merely looked tired. The regulations require me to verify origin and quality, not to make philosophical judgments about competitive practices. Your city's laws once set standards others emulated, the merchant responded. Now they serve mainly as barriers against the inevitable. By late afternoon, I found myself conversing with Theon, who sells imported books near the Stoa. His small shop serves as an informal gathering place for literate citizens of modest means. Today, several young men debated energetically while browsing his collection. The historical section grows while philosophy diminishes, I observed, noting the changing composition of his inventory. People increasingly prefer accounts of past greatness to theoretical works, Theon explained. Perhaps easier to celebrate previous achievements than create new ones. However, these foreign imports sell surprisingly well lately. He indicated scrolls from Alexandria, Rhodes, and points further east. Athenians reading foreign authors? Has our literary supremacy also faded? People seek fresh perspectives, Theon replied diplomatically. Though truthfully, many foreign writers now produce work equal to our own, often building upon Athenian foundations while adding insights from their own traditions. One young browser interjected himself into our conversation with the directness characteristic of his generation. The truly innovative thinking happens where traditions intersect, not where they stagnate in self-congratulation. Athens taught the world to think, but now refuses to learn from what the world has developed from those lessons. Rather than dismissing this impertinence as I might have years ago, I found myself asking, where would you look for the most vital, intellectual currents today? Alexandria for natural philosophy and mathematics, he answered without hesitation. Rhodes for international law and political theory. Even Rome begins to develop interesting approaches to practical governance, however crude their philosophical foundations. Athens remains preeminent in traditional philosophy, I defended mildly. Traditional is precisely the limitation, the young man replied. We excel at analyzing our intellectual history while others forge its future. I leave for Alexandria next month to study at the Mouseion. As the market began its evening transformation, food stalls closing, wine shops growing livelier, I reflected on how differently ordinary Athenians speak compared to those in positions of influence. The marketplace harbors fewer illusions about our city's trajectory than the council chambers or philosophical schools. Those who must test their beliefs daily against practical reality develop clarity sometimes absent in more rarefied discussions. A philosopher seeks truth, yet we sometimes forget that truth resides not only in elegant theories, but in the prosaic details of changing daily life. The irrigation channel that no longer flows properly tells us something more immediately relevant about civic decline than theoretical discussions of constitutional degradation. The departing apprentice represents brain drain more concretely than statistical analysis. Perhaps most revealing, none of the dozens of conversations I overheard today expressed shock about Athens's diminishing position. Rather, they demonstrated matter-of-fact adaptation to circumstances already accepted as reality. The philosophical question remains whether we who claim wisdom as our pursuit will recognize what the marketplace already knows, or continue constructing elegant arguments about a city that increasingly exists only in our imagination. The courier arrived as I was finishing my morning reading, a welcome interruption to Cleanthes's latest treatise on Stoic ethics, which recycles familiar arguments with greater certainty but diminishing insight. 3 scrolls bore the distinctive seal of the Library of Alexandria, correspondence from Theophrastus, who departed Athens 5 years ago after being denied the chair he rightfully deserved at the Lyceum. Political maneuvering elevated a lesser mind with better connections, and Alexandria gained one of our finest botanical philosophers. I unrolled the first scroll with a particular anticipation reserved for messages that travel great distances. Proximity breeds familiarity that dulls perception. Separation often sharpens insight. Theophrastus now views Athens through the dual lenses of intimate knowledge and external perspective, a combination that produces uncommon clarity. Dearest Aristodemus, he begins with customary warmth, Alexandria sends greetings to Athens, daughter to mother, student to teacher, and increasingly, inheritor to predecessor. His opening metaphors immediately establish the shifting relationship between our cities, a parentage that increasingly resembles succession rather than continuous nurturing. The rest of his letter alternates between breathless descriptions of Alexandrian intellectual life and pointed observations about Athenian stagnation. The Mouseion defies adequate description, he writes. Imagine the Lyceum and Academy combined, then multiply their resources tenfold. Over 50 scholars receive full support for research without teaching obligations unless they choose them. The botanical gardens contain specimens from Ethiopia to India, allowing observation impossible in Greece. The anatomical studies conducted here would scandalize Athenian sensibilities while advancing medical knowledge by generations. His enthusiasm reminds me of how we once spoke about Athens herself, with the wonder of participating in something unprecedented. Innovation requires not merely brilliant minds, but institutional structures that support exploration. We who take pride in Athens's intellectual heritage forget that frameworks matter as much as individual genius. The library now houses over 200,000 scrolls, Theophrastus continues, with new works arriving daily from across the known world. Ptolemy's agents purchase entire private collections and commission copies of every significant text they cannot acquire directly. More remarkable still is the systematic organization, subjects cataloged and cross-referenced for efficient retrieval, unlike the charming but haphazard arrangement of Athenian collections. Between descriptions, he inserts observations that cut like precisely wielded surgical tools. My Athenian colleagues write increasingly about what Greeks once discovered, rather than pursuing new discoveries themselves. They compile, analyze, and debate existing knowledge brilliantly, but rarely expand its boundaries. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Euclid reformulates mathematical understanding entirely. Herophilus maps the human nervous system through dissection, and astronomers compile observational data that will soon render portions of Aristotle's cosmology obsolete. His second scroll addresses political realities with equal frankness. Athens clings to the proud illusion of independence while her options narrow yearly. The Ptolemaic and Seleucid kingdoms grow stronger while Greek city-states become pieces in their grand strategies. Your Athenian assembly debates symbolic matters with magnificent oratory, but decisions of consequence increasingly happen in Alexandria, Antioch, and, though we resist admitting it, Rome. Power follows prosperity. Aristodemus, and prosperity now flows through new channels. I paused after this passage, watching sunlight pattern the wall of my study. Theophrastus always possessed the ability to articulate uncomfortable truths without cynicism, a balance I strive to maintain in my own thinking. His words voice observations I've sensed, but hesitated to formulate so explicitly. The third scroll shifted from analysis to something approaching entreaty. Consider joining us, old friend. The Mausion would welcome a mind of your caliber, with housing, stipend, and research support exceeding anything Athens now provides. Alexandria offers not just material benefits but intellectual liberation. Freedom to pursue questions without navigating entrenched Athenian factions and calcified orthodoxies. Several positions remain open specifically for philosophers of nature. He anticipates my reluctance, addressing it directly. You will object that leaving Athens represents abandonment. I once thought similarly. Having departed, I now recognize that carrying her finest intellectual traditions to fertile ground represents not betrayal but preservation. Athens' greatness never resided primarily in her buildings, but in her methods of inquiry. When those methods find better support elsewhere, loyalty to the spirit of Athenian philosophy might mean geographic relocation. This perspective challenges my instinctive equating of physical Athens with her intellectual essence. Can one remain an Athenian philosopher without remaining in Athens? The question contains uncomfortable implications about the relationship between ideas and their original contexts. Theophrastus concludes with an observation that haunted me through the afternoon. The library here collects and preserves everything of value from Athens' intellectual tradition, often maintaining better copies than exist in Athens herself. Should calamity befall the city, her thoughts would survive in Alexandrian archives. The Mausion already contains more complete collections of early Athenian philosophical works than any single location in Athens. We have become the custodians of your heritage even as we build upon it. The student now safeguards the teacher's wisdom more effectively than the teacher herself. I set aside the scrolls and walked to my window, gazing toward the Acropolis gleaming in afternoon light. The Parthenon stood as it has throughout my lifetime, seemingly permanent as the hills themselves. Yet Theophrastus's letters forced recognition that buildings endure while the activities that give them meaning evolve or migrate elsewhere. The structures of Athenian intellectual life remain largely intact, while the substance increasingly flows outward. After contemplation, I drafted a measured response that neither committed to nor rejected his invitation. My hesitation stems not primarily from material considerations, though at 62, relocation presents practical challenges, but from philosophical questions about obligation. What does a thinker owe to the society that nurtured his intellectual development? If that society now constrains rather than facilitates further growth, where does duty lie? Later in the afternoon, I received another visitor, young Archimedes, stopping in Athens briefly on his journey from studies in Alexandria back to his native Syracuse. Barely 25, he already demonstrates mathematical brilliance that makes me feel simultaneously proud as his former teacher and humbled by his superior insights. Athens remains beautiful, he offered politely as we walked through the olive grove near my home. The proportions of your architecture still teach fundamental principles of harmony. The phrasing was revealing. Your architecture, as if already speaking as an outsider. I inquired about his studies in Alexandria, and his face transformed, animated by genuine intellectual excitement I rarely observe in my current Athenian students. The mathematical work there transcends anything happening elsewhere, he explained. The library contains Egyptian and Babylonian mathematical texts unavailable in Greece, offering alternative approaches to problems we considered settled. The Interaction between different traditions creates opportunities for synthesis beyond what any single approach might develop. Yet those traditions lack the philosophical rigor of Greek mathematics, I suggested. His response was gentle but firm. They emphasize different aspects of mathematical truth. Combining Egyptian practical methods with Greek theoretical frameworks produces more comprehensive understanding than either alone. Alexandria encourages such integration where Athens often resists it. As darkness approached, we shared wine in my courtyard. Perhaps loosened by the vintage or comfortable with a former mentor, Archimedes spoke more directly about what he observed. Athens educates superbly in what is already known, he said, but Alexandria better supports discovery of what remains unknown. You taught me to follow questions wherever they lead, a fundamentally Athenian approach. Yet now Alexandria provides better conditions for applying that approach. After he departed, I returned to Theophrastus's letters, reading them against Archimedes' observations. Both describe similar patterns from different perspectives. The student who finds better opportunities elsewhere, the established scholar who relocates to continue his work effectively. Their testimonies suggest not sudden catastrophic decline, but gradual transfer of intellectual energy to more supportive environments. Most troubling is how little public discussion addresses this transition in Athens herself. Our assembly debates border disputes and festival funding, while the migration of our greatest minds receives minimal acknowledgement. We maintain the appearance of intellectual preeminence, while its substance increasingly resides overseas. Before retiring, I wrote a brief addendum to my response to Theophrastus. Your observations pierce more sharply for their affection rather than hostility toward Athens. We often dismiss critics as enemies, but the most valuable criticisms come from those who wish us well. I remain undecided about relocation, though your arguments resonate more deeply than I initially wished to admit. Whatever my personal decision, I thank you for the clarity that comes from distant perspective. Whether I eventually accept his invitation or remain in Athens, Theophrastus's letters have crystallized what I've sensed but incompletely articulated. Athens increasingly preserves intellectual traditions while Alexandria extends them. We excel at remembering who we were while others shape what comes next. This pattern appears neither as sudden collapse nor dramatic revolution, but as gradual transfer of energy from one center to another. A historical shift visible primarily to those willing to see beyond comforting illusions of unchanging preeminence. The invitation arrived today, inscribed on expensive Egyptian papyrus rather than common vellum, sealed with an ornate emblem I recognized immediately. The personal insignia of Demetrius, who styles himself the besieger. Though many whisper the tyrant when beyond earshot of his supporters, currently ascendant among the successors fighting over Alexander's fragmented legacy, he now controls Athens through what he calls protection, and what history will likely term occupation. To Aristodemus of Athens, honored philosopher and guardian of wisdom, the florid introduction begins, its excessive formality immediately raising my suspicions. Your reputation for clear thought and measured counsel has reached even my humble attention. I request the pleasure of your company at my residence tomorrow evening for a private symposium concerning matters of state and philosophy. A modest retainer accompanies this invitation as compensation for your valuable time. The modest retainer proved to be a small pouch containing 20 silver drachmae, more than many Athenians see in a month, offered merely for a single evening's conversation. Such generosity from power never comes without expectations. I set the coins aside, uncertain whether acceptance would constitute tacit agreement to whatever Demetrius might request. 3 other philosophers received similar invitations, I later learned: Cleanthes the Stoic, Hegesias from the Cyrenaic school, and old Theodorus, who teaches mathematical principles. We represent different philosophical traditions, suggesting Demetrius seeks not specific counsel, but the general appearance of philosophical sanction for whatever he has already decided. This pattern is hardly new. Alexander consulted Aristotle, while simultaneously ignoring his political advice. Dionysius of Syracuse invited Plato to his court, then grew furious when philosophical principles contradicted his desired policies. Tyrants seek the approval of thinkers without the inconvenience of adapting thought into action. Philosophy provides decorative intellectual trim for power's architectural designs, not their foundational blueprints. I discussed the invitation with Calliope, my most perceptive student, during this afternoon's tutorial. Her response proved characteristically direct. "You've already decided to attend," she observed with the particular clarity youth sometimes brings to ostensibly complex decisions. "Your curiosity about Demetrius's intentions outweighs your ethical objections to his methods." "My attendance doesn't imply endorsement," I countered. "Yet it inherently grants a measure of legitimacy he currently lacks," she argued. "Athens tolerates his control because resistance proved costly during the last uprising. He now seeks something beyond mere tolerance, the appearance of intellectual approval that your presence would confer, regardless of what you actually say." Her assessment cut uncomfortably close to truth. Demetrius rules through practical force, while craving the cultural legitimacy that has always mattered in Greek politics. Athens may no longer command significant military or economic power, but her intellectual prestige remains valuable political currency. By surrounding himself with philosophers, Demetrius acquires a patina of philosophical legitimacy without necessarily absorbing philosophical wisdom. "I might influence his thinking," I suggested, without much conviction. Calliope's smile contained gentle skepticism. "Power rarely seeks transformation through dialogue, Master. It seeks confirmation of existing intentions. Any counsel that aligns with predetermined plans will be celebrated as wisdom. Anything contrary will be politely acknowledged, then practically ignored." After she departed, I walked the city walls, contemplating the complicated dance between philosophy and power that has characterized Athenian history since Solon. At our finest moments, philosophical principles genuinely informed governance, though always imperfectly. At our worst, thinkers became ornamental fixtures in symposia, while decisions emerged from expediency rather than ethical reasoning. During my deliberation, I encountered Theodorus returning from the mathematics lesson he has conducted near the Dippolon Gate for 30 years. His response to Demetrius's invitation proved pragmatic in the extreme. "I shall attend, listen politely, offer mathematical truths if asked directly, and depart with payment that will support my work for several months," he stated with geometrical precision. My presence neither endorses nor condemns his politics. Numbers maintain their integrity regardless of who calculates them. Yet he seeks more than mathematical counsel, I suggested. "Undoubtedly," Theodorus agreed. "He seeks association with whatever prestige remains attached to Athenian intellectual life. But consider Aristodemus. If Athenian philosophy still commands such respect that even conquerors court its approval, perhaps we retain more influence than your recent melancholy suggests." His perspective gave me pause. Perhaps some essence of Athenian intellectual authority endures, despite our political subordination and economic decline. If so, how best to steward that remaining influence? Through principled separation from power, or through strategic engagement that might occasionally moderate its excesses? By evening, I had decided to accept the invitation while maintaining philosophical independence. That narrow path Aristotle attempted to walk as Alexander's tutor, with debatable success. I composed a brief, formal acceptance, then wrote a more personal reflection in this private journal. Philosophy's relationship to power resembles that between physician and patient. We can diagnose with accuracy, prescribe with wisdom, but cannot force the treatment's implementation. The patient may ignore advice entirely, follow it selectively, or claim compliance while secretly pursuing destructive habits. Yet the physician's duty remains, to speak truth regardless of its reception. This morning brought confirmation of my suspicions. Cleanthes visited during breakfast, reporting a private conversation with Hegesias, who regularly frequents court circles. Demetrius plans to announce relocation of several prominent Egyptian scholars to Athens, funded by his treasury, Cleanthes explained. He presents this as cultural renewal, Athens' intellectual restoration under his patronage. Our presence tomorrow provides philosophical witnesses to this supposed renaissance. The strategy reveals sophisticated understanding of perception's importance in governance. Demetrius cannot restore Athenian political dominance, but through strategic investment might create appearance of intellectual revitalization that burnishes his reputation both locally and internationally. Our attendance transforms us from independent philosophers into supporting actors in his political theater. Will you still attend? I asked Cleanthes. Yes, though with clearer understanding of my role in his performance, he replied. I shall observe closely how power attempts to manipulate philosophy rather than be guided by it. Such observations themselves constitute philosophical data worth collecting. His response articulated my own conclusion. Perhaps the philosopher's task involves not just developing wisdom, but witnessing how that wisdom becomes distorted when encountering power's gravitational field. By observing this process consciously rather than participating naively, we maintain some measure of intellectual integrity despite our inevitable co-option. As I prepare for tomorrow's symposium, I find myself contemplating the parallels between Demetrius' relationship with Athens and Rome's emerging relationship with Greece overall. Both recognize cultural and intellectual value, while exercising increasing practical control. Both preserve institutional forms while transforming their substance. Both seek legitimacy through association with traditions they simultaneously undermine. Through their methods of governance, philosophy once shaped Athens. Now it primarily interprets her, offering perspective on transitions beyond our control. Perhaps this more modest role reflects historical necessity rather than intellectual failure. If wisdom cannot direct power's course, it can at least illuminate its nature and consequences. Cold comfort to those who imagined philosophy might create the just society, but better than complete irrelevance. I shall bring this journal tomorrow, recording observations about this latest attempt to harness Athens' intellectual prestige to power's chariot. The invitation itself already tells a significant story about our city's changing position, still respected for our intellectual heritage, increasingly irrelevant to practical governance, and gradually becoming decorative rather than foundational in the emerging political order. Sleep has abandoned me to dreams I cannot dismiss as mere phantasms of an aging mind. For 3 nights consecutively, similar visions have interrupted my rest, leaving me more exhausted at dawn than when I retired. While I maintain philosophical skepticism about divine messages during wakefulness, these recurring images possess a clarity and emotional resonance that demand interpretation beyond mere physiological explanation. The dream begins innocuously. I stand in a vast library that resembles none in Athens, yet somehow contains elements of them all. Scrolls fill shelves stretching beyond vision, their carefully labeled cylinders organized with mathematical precision. The quality of light seems important, though I cannot name why. A golden illumination without visible source, perfect for reading yet somehow tinged with impermanence, as if the brightness itself contains foreknowledge of coming darkness. I move through this impossible archive, touching scrolls whose labels bear names I recognize: Plato, Aristotle, Democritus, Heraclitus, alongside others partially obscured or written in scripts I cannot decipher. The sensation of simultaneous recognition and unfamiliarity persists throughout, creating a particular disquiet. This library contains not just what we have written, but what we might have written. Not merely what we have preserved, but what we have already lost without realizing. Then comes the disturbing transformation. I notice a thin tendril of smoke emerging from between scrolls near the section containing natural philosophy texts. Before I can reach for it, Another appears elsewhere. Then another. Small spirals of destruction appearing simultaneously throughout the vast collection. I try to remove endangered scrolls but find my movements unnaturally slowed, as if swimming through honey rather than air. By the time I grasp one manuscript, 3 more have begun smoldering. The conflagration accelerates with dreamlike inevitability. Flames consume entire sections while I stand helpless, watching generations of thought reduced to ash and ember. The most disturbing aspect, the fire burns with almost surgical precision, destroying specific works while leaving others untouched. Certain scrolls appear immune to the destruction, mostly practical manuals, simplified commentaries, and texts that flatter power rather than challenge it. The essential works, those containing original insights, fundamental challenges to orthodoxy, or uncomfortable political truths, burn first and most thoroughly. I recognize this pattern while unable to alter it, comprehending its significance with that peculiar dual consciousness dreams sometimes permit. I am simultaneously participant and witness, involved, yet observing from reflective distance. Last night, the dream expanded, revealing additional layers of meaning. As scrolls burned, their contents did not simply disappear, but transformed. Characters lifted from disintegrating parchment, floating upward like luminous smoke, rearranging themselves on the walls of buildings visible through suddenly transparent library walls. I recognized Athens, Alexandria, Antioch, then cities unfamiliar to waking knowledge. Perhaps Rome grown to future magnificence. Perhaps places not yet built in lands I'll never visit. The knowledge contained in our scrolls dispersed, fragmenting across these distant locations. No single location held complete collections. Each preserved portions while losing others. As I watched this diaspora of ideas, figures appeared within these distant repositories. Scholars I didn't recognize, dressed in garments of unfamiliar design, examining fragments of what once existed as unified traditions. They worked diligently, yet possessed only incomplete understanding, like craftsmen assembling mosaics with crucial pieces missing. What disturbs me most about these dreams is not their apocalyptic quality but their strange beauty and air of necessity. The destruction unfolds not as chaotic tragedy, but as inevitable transition, governed by patterns I recognize but cannot articulate upon waking. These visions suggest not random loss, but selective preservation and transformation. Knowledge changing, states rather than simply perishing, yet becoming fundamentally altered through that transformation. I consulted old Timaeus this morning, who interprets dreams at his small shrine near the Ilissos River. While philosophical training leaves me skeptical of divination, his practical experience with the dreaming mind spans 50 years. He listened carefully to my account, his weathered face revealing neither surprise nor dismissal. "You dream not merely of scrolls burning," he observed after long consideration, "but of transition and how knowledge itself exists in the world. Fire in dreams rarely represents simple destruction, more often transformation, purification, or necessary release." "These are works containing generations of wisdom," I objected. "Their loss cannot possibly represent necessity. Consider that knowledge exists in multiple forms," he countered. "What appears as destruction from one perspective may be adaptation from another. Scrolls burn, yes, but their contents migrate elsewhere in your vision. Perhaps you witness not knowledge vanishing but changing its dwelling place and nature." His interpretation aligned uncomfortably with my waking observations of Athens' changing intellectual position. The dream presents in symbolic form what I've been documenting more literally: the gradual dispersal of our concentrated intellectual tradition, its selective preservation in distant locations, and the inevitability of loss accompanying that transition. "The dream comes not to reveal what you don't know," Timaeus suggested, "but to force integration of what you already understand but resist fully acknowledging. Your waking mind grasps these patterns intellectually, while your dreaming mind processes their emotional and existential implications. This perspective, dreams as internal dialogue rather than external communication, follows Aristotle's naturalistic interpretation against more supernaturally inclined Platonists. Yet even this rational framing provides little comfort. If these dreams represent my deeper understanding of historical patterns, they suggest transformations more profound than I've allowed myself to consciously articulate. I spent the afternoon in my garden, contemplating both the dreams and Timaeus's interpretation. If we understand dreams as processing what waking consciousness hasn't fully integrated, mine suggests conclusions I've approached but not explicitly formulated about Athens' intellectual future. The selective nature of destruction in the dream particularly haunts me. Not all knowledge burns. Practical techniques, simplified commentaries, and politically convenient philosophies survive. What perishes most completely are original insights that challenge fundamental assumptions, works requiring sophisticated contextual understanding, traditions demanding dedicated scholarly communities for proper interpretation. This pattern mirrors what I already observe in Athens' intellectual decline. As our educational institutions contract and resources diminish, we preserve philosophical traditions in increasingly simplified forms. Complex arguments become reduced to portable maxims, nuanced positions collapse into rigid doctrines, and the contextual understanding that once surrounded ideas gradually erodes. Philosophy becomes increasingly performative rather than generative. We recite Plato's conclusions without recreating his methods of inquiry. The dream's portrayal of knowledge dispersing across distant locations aligns with Theophrastus's letters describing Alexandria's collection efforts. Perhaps what we experience as decline actually represents redistribution, concentrated excellence giving way to distributed preservation. Yet something fundamental changes in that transition. The unified traditions that developed through sustained dialogue within Athens become fragmented, with distant inheritors receiving parts without the integrated whole. Before dinner, I received an unexpected visitor, young Hermippus, who studies ancient religious texts rather than conventional philosophy. When I mentioned my dream in passing, his response suggested different interpretative frameworks. The ancient mystery traditions would understand your vision as prophecy rather than mere psychological processing, he explained. Fire purifies, while transforming matter from one state to another. What appears as destruction often represents necessary transition between world ages. You suggest these dreams portend actual physical destruction? I asked skeptically. Not necessarily literal. Flames, he clarified, but transformation no less fundamental. Perhaps your dreaming mind perceives patterns extending beyond individual or even civic lifespans. Historical currents visible only when consciousness expands beyond its normal boundaries. While I maintain philosophical reservations about prophetic interpretation, his perspective offers conceptual parallels to observable historical patterns. Civilizations do move through distinct phases analogous to human development. Athens' intellectual flowering represented a particular confluence of factors: political freedom, economic prosperity, cultural confidence, that created unprecedented space for philosophical inquiry. As these conditions change, the knowledge created during that flowering necessarily changes form to survive. Perhaps most significantly, Hermippus suggested examining what survives the dream fire, rather than focusing exclusively on what burns. In purification rituals, what remains after flame represents the essential, he noted. Your dream shows certain works surviving. Rather than mourning what transforms, perhaps identify what persists, those elements of Athenian thought resilient enough to transcend historical circumstance. This perspective shifted my interpretation considerably. If the dream represents not just destruction, but discriminating purification, it suggests that portions of our intellectual tradition contain elements of lasting value alongside others, of merely temporary significance. Not all philosophical work deserves preservation. Perhaps time naturally selects what addresses perennial human questions, while discarding topical concerns with diminishing relevance. As night approaches again, I prepare for sleep with both anticipation and apprehension. Will the dream continue, revealing further dimensions of this symbolic conflagration? I have placed writing materials beside my bed to record impressions immediately upon waking, hoping to capture nuances lost in translation from dream consciousness to daylight rationality. These visions, whether divine communication, subconscious integration, or simply the mind's attempt to process historical patterns too complex for immediate comprehension, have forced recognition of transitions I've observed but incompletely acknowledged. Athens' intellectual moment appears increasingly as historical exception rather than permanent achievement, a flowering already releasing seeds to winds that carry them beyond our walls. The philosopher's task includes bearing witness to such transitions, neither denying uncomfortable patterns nor surrendering to fatalistic resignation. If my dreams show Athens' concentrated intellectual tradition dispersing, they also reveal its partial preservation through transformation. What matters increasingly is not maintaining institutional continuity, but identifying essential elements, worth transmitting to inheritors we may never meet in places we may never visit. The question came during what should have been a routine lecture on Aristotle's metaphysics, an unexpected challenge that silenced the small courtyard where I teach the 12 students committed enough to pursue philosophy beyond superficial introduction. Theocritus, whose mathematical precision usually manifests as clarifying questions about terminological distinctions, instead directed our discussion toward uncomfortable territory. "Master Aristodemus," he asked, pausing to formulate his words carefully, "we spend considerable time analyzing how Aristotle modified Plato's theories and how Plato transformed Socratic inquiry. But what original philosophical frameworks has Athens produced in the last 50 years? Has our city's contribution become primarily commentary rather than creation?" His question hung in the morning air, disturbing the pigeons that occasionally visit our olive tree, as surely as it disturbed my prepared lesson. I glanced around the courtyard, expecting to find dismissive expressions from students loyal to Athenian intellectual tradition. Instead, I encountered faces showing recognition of a question they themselves had contemplated but hesitated to voice. Calliope, seated near the small fountain that provides pleasant background melody to our discussions, nodded slightly. "I've examined the philosophical treatises published in Athens during the last 3 decades, she added. "Most primarily reorganize existing philosophical positions or resolve minor contradictions within established systems. Genuinely novel approaches appear more frequently in works from Rhodes or Alexandria. Commentary serves essential functions," I responded defensively, "clarifying foundational insights, resolving apparent contradictions, applying established principles to new circumstances. These represent legitimate philosophical work." "Unquestionably," Theocritus acknowledged. "Yet commentary alone cannot sustain philosophical vitality indefinitely. Plato didn't merely explain Socrates, he transformed Socratic questioning into comprehensive metaphysical framework. Aristotle didn't simply clarify Plato, but developed entirely new approaches to categorization and causality. The conversation had veered dangerously from exegesis toward evaluation of Athens' current intellectual production, territory I'd instinctively avoided in teaching. Now my students pressed into this uncomfortable space with the directness of minds not yet invested in maintaining comfortable illusions. "Perhaps," offered Apollodorus, a student from a wealthy family destined for political involvement, "we might distinguish between conditions that produced original philosophical frameworks and those that foster refined commentary. Athens once combined political autonomy, economic prosperity, and cultural confidence, creating space for fundamental questioning. As these conditions change, the nature of our philosophical production naturally evolves. His analysis echoed my private reflections with disturbing accuracy. The historical pattern seems increasingly clear. Foundational philosophical innovation emerges during periods of cultural florescence, while commentary and systematization dominate during decline. If true, this suggests Athens' current intellectual production reflects our position in a historical trajectory rather than simple failure of imagination. Conditions differ for our generation, noted Demetria, one of 3 women who brave social disapproval to attend philosophical instruction. You studied when Athens still commanded significant independence and resources. We enter philosophical training amidst constraint and contraction. Which raises another question, interjected Critias, whose provocative challenges often push discussions into productive discomfort. Does philosophical education in contemporary Athens prepare us adequately for the world we actually inhabit? We study arguments optimized for a political and cultural context rapidly disappearing around us. The courtyard fell silent again. His question cut to the heart of my growing concerns about my own teaching, the possibility that I prepare students for intellectual engagement with conditions that no longer predominate. Athens developed philosophical methods brilliantly suited to independent city-state governance within Hellenic cultural framework. As larger kingdoms and foreign powers increasingly determine our circumstances, do our traditional approaches maintain relevance? What alternatives would you propose? I asked, genuinely curious rather than merely defensive. Their responses revealed how differently my students perceive our intellectual environment compared to my own generation. Several immediately suggested modifications to traditional Athenian philosophical education that would have seemed heretical during my own training. Integration of Egyptian mathematical methods alongside Greek geometrical approaches, offered Theocritus. Their computational techniques solve practical problems our theoretical models struggle to address. Systematic study of Persian and Babylonian governance structures, suggested Apollodorus. Their administrative systems manage diverse populations across vast territories, challenges Athens never confronted, but now impact our existence within larger imperial frameworks. Philosophical examination of Roman legal concepts, added Critias. Their pragmatic approach to justice differs fundamentally from our theoretical frameworks, but demonstrates remarkable effectiveness in practice. Most striking was not any particular suggestion, but the students' shared assumption that philosophical education should incorporate traditions beyond our Hellenic boundaries. Where my generation perceived clear distinctions between Greek wisdom and barbarian knowledge, they see potentially valuable intellectual exchange. Their perspective aligns with Alexandria's integrative approach, rather than Athens' traditionally more bounded conception of philosophical inquiry. When we adjourned for the day, 3 students remained to continue the conversation: Calliope, Theocritus, and young Aristander, whose quiet demeanor masks uncommon observational acuity. Their lingering questions revealed how differently they view Athens' position compared to official narratives. I've received correspondence about study opportunities in Alexandria, Theocritus confided. The Mouseion offers mathematical instruction, integrating traditions we don't access here, with research support impossible in Athens. Yet cultural loyalty creates hesitation about departing. The decision extends beyond personal advantage, Calliope responded. When promising students systematically, select opportunities elsewhere, what remains here gradually diminishes. Each departure individually rational. Collectively, they ensure decline. Yet might some departures actually preserve Athenian intellectual traditions? Aristander suggested quietly. If Athenian methods transfer to environments with greater resources and institutional support, perhaps they evolve rather than disappear. The vessel matters less than what it contains. Their discussion mirrors tensions within my own thinking, balancing personal intellectual development against civic obligation, weighing loyalty to tradition against adaptation to changing circumstances. These students see Athens diminishing position with painful clarity, yet their responses differ. Some prepare to depart for more promising shores, others commit to remaining despite limitations. All recognize the constraints of our current circumstances more honestly than many established philosophers. After they departed, I remained in the courtyard, watching afternoon light pattern the worn stones where Aristotle himself once lectured. My students' questions penetrated more deeply than they likely realized, challenging not just my teaching content, but its underlying assumptions. Have I prepared them for the world they actually face, rather than the Athens I remember or imagine? Does philosophical education that assumes continued Athenian cultural primacy serve students entering a Mediterranean world increasingly centered elsewhere? The conversation recalled uncomfortable memories of my own teacher's final years. I watched him maintain unwavering commitment to traditional Athenian approaches, while dismissing emerging alternatives as intellectual degradation rather than evolution. At the time, I attributed his rigidity to personal temperament. Increasingly, I recognize how institutional position incentivizes resistance to evidence of fundamental transition. Those who excel within established systems naturally resist acknowledgement of their diminishing relevance. Am I repeating this pattern with my own students? They perceive cracks in our intellectual edifice with the particular clarity of those not yet invested in maintaining institutional facades. Their questions don't merely seek information, but permission to recognize what they already observe. Athens' transformation from intellectual wellspring to tributary feeding larger currents. This evening I reviewed the philosophical treatises published in Athens during the past decade, testing Calliope's assertion about their predominantly commentary nature. The evidence supports her observation. We excel at analyzing, organizing, and extending established philosophical frameworks, while producing few genuinely novel approaches. This pattern itself constitutes valuable data about our current intellectual phase, though we resist its implications. Perhaps most revealing was my involuntary defensive response to their observations, an instinct to justify current production rather than evaluate it objectively. This reaction exemplifies how emotional investment in Athenian exceptionalism creates resistance to evidence of transition. My students, less burdened by such investment, see patterns I instinctively avoid acknowledging. Before retiring, I drafted revised teaching plans incorporating elements my students suggested: comparative examination of mathematical approaches across traditions, analysis of administrative systems beyond Greek models, consideration of legal frameworks from emerging powers. Whether these modifications represent progressive adaptation or tacit surrender to changing circumstances remains unclear, even to myself. Whatever Athens becomes in coming generations, today's conversation revealed something significant about philosophical inquiry itself. Genuine questioning thrives not in confident prosperity, but in spaces where uncertainty creates both anxiety and opportunity. My students, inhabiting historical transition rather than established certainty, may develop perspectives impossible during periods of unquestioned cultural dominance. Athens' intellectual flowering emerged not during political hegemony, but during engagement with challenges that disrupted comfortable assumptions. Perhaps this generation's contribution will emerge precisely from inhabiting the uncomfortable space between fading tradition and emerging alternatives, developing philosophy particularly suited to navigating historical transition rather than maintaining established patterns. If so, their questions represent not merely critique of Athens' diminishing production, but early articulation of approaches responsive to changing conditions. The philosopher's task includes recognizing wisdom regardless of its source, even when it emerges from those we ostensibly teach, rather than those who taught us. Today my students became my instructors, illuminating blind spots created by my own investment in Athenian intellectual continuity. Whatever Athens becomes, philosophical inquiry continues through minds committed to questioning regardless of institutional affiliation or geographical location. An unexpected invitation arrived yesterday from Callicrates. recently retired as commander of what remains of Athens' once formidable fleet. His messenger requested my presence not at his substantial home near the harbor, but at a modest taverna in Piraeus, frequented by sailors and shipwrights. The location itself constituted a message. He sought conversation outside the formal constraints of Athenian social ritual, in surroundings where practical men speak plainly. The harbor presented a study in contradiction as I arrived near sunset. Impressive infrastructure from our maritime zenith, massive stone quays, fortified warehouses, specialized loading equipment, still dominated the physical landscape. Yet these magnificent structures stood notably underutilized. Where 300 triremes once crowded the naval yards, perhaps 40 vessels now occupied the slips, many visibly aging. Workers moved with unhurried pace rather than the energetic purpose I recall from visits in my youth. Callicrates awaited me at a corner table, a cup of unwatered wine already half empty before him. 20 years my junior, he nonetheless appears older, his face weathered by sun and sea, his right arm bearing a pronounced scar from the naval engagement with Antigonus that cost Athens 3 warships and any pretense of maritime supremacy. Military command ages men differently than philosophical contemplation. I expected a philosopher to decline invitation to such plebeian surroundings. He opened with the direct speech characteristic of naval officers. Your generation usually prefers symposia with watered wine and carefully measured conversation. Wisdom sometimes hides in unexpected vessels, I replied, accepting the cup of rough local vintage he pushed toward me, including those containing unwatered wine and unfiltered speech. His laugh carried genuine appreciation. This is why I sought you specifically. Your reputation suggests willingness to hear uncomfortable truths rather than comforting illusions. Most philosophers I've encountered prefer constructing elegant arguments about how Athens remains preeminent while ignoring contrary evidence visible from any harbor vantage point. The taverna filled with working men as evening deepened. Carpenters still carrying sawdust in their beards. Sailors between voyages. Merchants discussing tomorrow's shipments. Their conversations provided appropriate backdrop for what quickly became the most candid assessment of Athens' position I've yet encountered. I've commanded steadily diminishing naval resources for 15 years, Callicrates began, signaling, for more wine. Each year, the Assembly votes smaller allocations while expecting maintained capability. Each year, experienced crews depart for better-paying positions with Egyptian or Rhodian fleets. Each year, I've submitted reports documenting our declining capacity relative to potential adversaries. The Assembly debates these reports? I inquired. His expression combined bitterness with resignation. They're received, acknowledged, then effectively ignored. Occasional passionate speeches decry our naval deterioration, followed by budget decisions that ensure its continuation. We've become adept at maintaining appearances while surrendering substance, refurbishing visible harbor installations while neglecting hull maintenance, staging impressive ceremonial reviews with vessels that wouldn't survive actual combat engagement. This pattern extended beyond naval affairs, he explained. Athens maintains elaborate military ceremonies celebrating traditions established during our imperial height, while actual defense increasingly depends on unreliable alliances and strategic irrelevance rather than genuine capability. The gap between military appearance and reality grows steadily, with institutional resistance to acknowledging the disparity. Military professionals face reality's judgment directly, Callicrates observed. A naval commander who maintains comforting illusions loses ships and men. A general who overestimates capability loses battles and territory. Yet civilian leadership faces no such immediate consequences for preferred delusions, particularly when decline occurs gradually enough to blame each setback on temporary circumstances rather than structural deterioration. I asked what convinced him to retire when his experience remained valuable. His response proved unexpectedly philosophical. I departed when required to publicly endorse assessments I privately knew false, he explained. My final orders included certifying our fleet combat-ready for potential confrontation with Rhodes, despite my written evaluation documenting significant deficiencies in crew training, vessel maintenance, and logistical support. When military judgment becomes subordinate to political narrative, professional integrity demands withdrawal. What followed was the most comprehensive analysis of Athenian military position I've encountered, delivered not with academic detachment, but with the precise assessment of a commander who has calculated capability against potential threats. The particulars proved more disturbing than my general awareness had suggested. We retain perhaps 20 vessels truly combat-capable by contemporary standards, he stated flatly. Rhodes maintains 60 with superior design and crew training. Egypt could deploy over 80 against us if relations deteriorated. Even modest commercial powers like Byzantium or Corcyra now field naval forces comparable to ours. The Assembly receives this information? I asked. In carefully measured portions unlikely to provoke genuine alarm, Callicrates replied. Military assessments undergo revision as they ascend reporting hierarchies, with uncomfortable specifics gradually replaced by generalized assurances. By the time information reaches decision-makers, precision has given way to palatability. This systematic distortion of military reality parallels what I've observed in intellectual spheres, the institutional tendency to maintain comforting narratives despite accumulating contrary evidence. Whether naval capability or philosophical influence, Athens excels at preserving appearances while underlying substance deteriorates. As the taverna grew more crowded, Callicrates leaned closer, lowering his voice. The true crisis extends beyond material decline. Athenian naval supremacy once rested on deeper foundations than vessel count or naval infrastructure. Our crews believed themselves inheritors of Salamis and Artemisium, defenders of civilization. Against barbarism, free men superior to subjects of despots. This belief made Athenian sailors fight harder, take greater risks, endure more significant hardship than adversaries. This spiritual foundation has eroded? I inquired. Collapsed entirely, he answered without hesitation. Today's crews serve for payment, not patriotic principle. They compare compensation to what Egypt or Rhodes offers, rather than viewing service as civic duty. When facing vessels from wealthier powers, they calculate risk against reward, and find retreat increasingly rational. The intangible advantages that once multiplied our material strength have vanished, while official assessments continue measuring only physical assets. Most revealing was his comparison between Athens' military trajectory and her intellectual decline, patterns I'd considered separately, but which he integrated into comprehensive analysis. Military effectiveness requires continual adaptation to changing conditions, he explained. New vessel designs, modified tactics, improved training methods, successful naval powers constantly evolve. Athens once led such innovation. Now we primarily preserve traditions established during previous eras, while others develop approaches better suited to current circumstances. The parallel to our philosophical stagnation seemed uncomfortably precise. We excel at maintaining intellectual traditions established during our golden age while generating minimal innovation relevant to changed conditions. Whether naval architecture or philosophical frameworks, we increasingly preserve rather than create, commemorate rather than advance. Have you shared these assessments with political leadership? I asked. Callicrates' laugh contained no humor. I submitted comprehensive analysis before retirement, documenting not just material deficiencies, but underlying spiritual and institutional deterioration. The report received formal acknowledgement, polite thanks for my service, and immediate archival burial. 3 months later, the Assembly approved a naval budget addressing none of the fundamental issues identified while increasing expenditure on ceremonial functions that maintain public perception of maritime strength. As our conversation extended into night, the retired admiral revealed perspective rarely acknowledged in philosophical circles. Athens no longer controls her destiny, but survives primarily through others' calculation. That direct conquest offers minimal advantage compared to gradually increasing influence. Our continued existence depends not on our strength, but on potential adversaries' assessment that formal subjugation creates more problems than benefits, compared to gradual absorption. Rhodes could establish naval blockade we couldn't effectively counter, Callicrates stated plainly. Egypt could deploy overwhelming force if they considered direct control worth the diplomatic complications. Even emerging Rome could remove our independence if they considered the effort worthwhile. We exist at their collective sufferance, not through our own capacity. Before departing, he offered observation that has haunted me through the day. Your philosophers debate whether Athens' greatness continues undiminished or faces temporary setback. Military reality suggests neither. We experience not momentary decline but fundamental transformation from independent power to cultural subsidiary, preserved for historical significance rather than current capability. The relevant question isn't whether we can restore previous position, but how we might contribute meaningfully within dramatically altered circumstances. Walking home through darkened streets past the long walls that once secured our connection to maritime power, I found myself reconsidering Athens' position through Callicrates' unsparing assessment. Philosophers naturally examine decline through intellectual and cultural metrics, diminishing philosophical innovation, cultural production, educational excellence. Military perspective evaluates more fundamental capacity for self-determination, the ability to maintain independence through strength rather than others' calculation or sentiment. By this metric, Athenian decline appears not merely aesthetic or intellectual, but existential. We persist not through our capacity to determine our fate, but through great powers' assessment that our continued nominal independence serves their interests better than formal incorporation. This reality, clearly visible to those responsible for defense yet scarcely acknowledged in philosophical discourse, transforms how we might understand our current position and future prospects. If Athens' greatness once integrated intellectual achievement with material power sufficient to determine our own course, our current circumstance represents not simple continuation or temporary setback, but transformation into fundamentally different entity, a cultural repository valued for historical significance rather than current capability, maintaining appearance of autonomy primarily through others' calculation rather than our own strength. This perspective suggests philosophical questions different from those we typically examine. Rather than debating whether Athens remains preeminent or faces temporary decline, perhaps we should consider how cultural and intellectual contributions might continue meaningfully under conditions of significantly reduced self-determination. If our material capacity no longer matches our cultural ambition, how might wisdom itself adapt to circumstances where we influence through thought rather than power? Callicrates' unvarnished military assessment may ultimately prove more philosophically productive than many treatises I've recently encountered, forcing recognition of fundamental transformation rather than incremental adjustment, suggesting questions relevant to our actual condition rather than comforting illusions about our status. Wisdom begins with accurate perception, however uncomfortable. Today, a retired admiral displayed philosophical virtue too often absent from philosophers themselves: willingness to acknowledge reality regardless of its alignment with preferred narrative. I attended the Panathenaic procession today, that most sacred of Athenian rituals where we honor Athena with offerings, sacrifices, and the presentation of the new peplos woven by selected maidens. Outwardly, the ceremony maintained its ancient splendor, the procession route purified with lustral water, maidens bearing sacred baskets, aristocratic daughters carrying ritual implements, elders holding olive branches, and the magnificent peplos itself displayed like a sail upon the ceremonial cart. Yet something fundamental has changed since my youth. The forms remain perfect, while the substance has thinned like watered wine. I watched faces closely as participants moved through prescribed motions, the rote performance of ritual actions without the luminous presence of genuine connection. We have become expert technicians of ceremony, while the living breath of faith grows increasingly shallow. The procession appears grander each year, observed Philemon beside me. A wealthy merchant who funds substantial portions of public festivals. We've added 16 musicians, commissioned new gold vessels for the offerings, and increased the sacrificial bulls from 6 to 8. His pride reflected our contemporary approach to religious observance, measuring devotion through expenditure and spectacle rather than spiritual engagement. The procession indeed presented magnificent appearance, each element carefully choreographed for maximum visual impact. Yet the faces of participants revealed the mechanical nature of their participation, performing roles rather than embodying them. I recalled processions from my childhood, when participants moved with the particular quality that emerges when outer action aligns with inner conviction. Today's maidens carrying sacred baskets maintained perfect posture and practiced smiles, while their eyes revealed calculations entirely separate from their physical movements. Social assessments, awareness of being observed, concern with appearances. The gap between ceremonial form and internal experience has widened into chasm. After the official ceremonies concluded, I visited Theano, priestess of Athena Polius, for over 40 years. Age has bent her frame, but sharpened her perception. We sat in the small chamber behind the sanctuary, where she receives private consultations. The ancient olive-wood statue of Athena, visible through the doorway, draped now in its magnificent new peplos. The garment grows more elaborate each year, she noted, following my gaze. The embroidery finer, the materials more expensive, the craftsmanship more intricate. Yet I sometimes wonder whether Athena herself notices our increasing investment in appearance while our attention to essence diminishes. Her observation cut to the heart of what I'd witnessed throughout the day, the growing gap between ritual magnificence and spiritual investment. Athens maintains religious ceremonies with increasing material splendor, while the internal dimension of worship grows increasingly hollow. We excel at performing religion while faith itself becomes optional. When did you first notice this shift? I asked, curious whether her experience aligned with my own observations. The change came gradually. Like age itself, she replied, adjusting the sacred keys hanging at her waist. Perhaps 20 years ago, I began observing subtle differences in those seeking divine guidance. They requested more specific interventions, success in business ventures, advantage in legal disputes, improved marriage prospects, while showing less interest in fundamental questions of right relation with divine principles. Transactional rather than transformational engagement, I suggested. Precisely, Theano nodded. They approach divinity as they might approach marketplace vendors, seeking favorable exchange rather than alignment with larger purpose. The gods become means toward human ends, rather than representatives of principles worthy of alignment regardless of immediate benefit. This pattern extends beyond individual worship to our collective ceremonies. The Panathenaic procession once embodied Athens' spiritual identity, expressing gratitude to our divine patroness, while renewing our commitment to the wisdom, courage, and justice she represents. Now it functions primarily as civic performance, demonstrating Athens' continued ability to mount impressive spectacles despite diminishing practical power. The peplos presented today contains 20% more gold thread than last year's garment, Theano observed. Yet fewer participants could correctly explain the meaning of the scenes depicted in the embroidery. We increasing adorn without understanding what we adorn. This observation parallels patterns visible throughout Athenian life. Institutional forms maintained with increasing emphasis on external appearance, while internal understanding and commitment diminish. We preserve religious ceremonies with the same careful attention we preserve philosophical traditions or military formations, focusing on accurate reproduction of established forms, while connection to their animating spirit fades. Do you believe Athena still extends her protection over Athens? I asked, the question more direct than I would pose in public discourse. Theano considered carefully before responding, her gaze moving from the ancient statue to the Acropolis visible through the small window. I believe she remains present for those who approach with genuine reverence rather than performative display. But a patron deity responds to the collective spiritual condition of her people, not merely to elaborate ceremonies conducted without corresponding internal commitment. Her answer reflected traditional theological understanding, while acknowledging our changing relationship with divine principles. The gods have not abandoned Athens, this view suggests, but our capacity to maintain substantive connection with them diminishes as we substitute ceremonial performance for genuine engagement. Later in the afternoon, I observed another revealing scene near the temple of Zeus Olympios. A group of wealthy young men performed the customary sacrifices with technical precision. The ritual washing, the grain scattered on the victim's head, the prescribed prayers recited without error. Yet immediately following these solemn observances, their conversation revealed complete disconnection from the ceremony they had just completed. "Did you notice Aristippus observing from the colonnade?" one asked another. "His family controls the committee that selects public priests for next year's appointments. Make certain he reports your perfect performance to your father." "I nearly invoked Apollo instead of Zeus in the third prayer," another laughed. "Fortunately, I caught myself before embarrassing my family before half the council members." Their discussion contained no reference to Zeus himself, no consideration of divine presence, no reflection on the ceremony's meaning beyond its social and political implications. The ritual had become entirely performative, valuable for its social signaling rather than its spiritual content. They had mastered the choreography of worship while emptying it of substantive connection to the divine principles it supposedly honors. This same pattern appears in philosophical discourse about the gods, where vigorous theological debate once examined fundamental questions about divine nature and human obligation. Contemporary discussions increasingly focus on reconciling traditional observances with practical skepticism. We maintain elaborate intellectual frameworks justifying ritual participation, while silently accommodating widespread doubt about the ceremony's efficacy or meaning. Traditional religious understanding situated Athens within cosmic order where divine principles, wisdom, justice, moderation, manifested through both natural patterns and human institutions. This framework provided not just theological doctrine, but orientation toward existence itself. As commitment to this understanding fades, we maintain its external expressions while losing the internal coherence it once provided. Before returning home, I made my own small offering at the modest shrine to Hestia near the public hearth. And Tuel, elderly caretaker, approached as I completed the simple ritual, his expression suggesting recognition of something in my manner of observance. "You still perform the preparatory meditation before presenting offerings," he noted. "Few remember that practice now, though it was once considered essential." "The external ritual seems empty without internal preparation," I explained. He nodded, with evident appreciation. "The younger priests focus on precise physical movements and perfect recitation. They perform flawlessly but often create no opening for divine presence to enter the ceremony. Technical perfection without spiritual receptivity yields rituals that proceed exactly as planned, which means no space remains for anything beyond human action." His observation crystallized what I had witnessed throughout the day. Our ceremonies grow increasingly elaborate, while creating less opportunity for genuine encounter with what they supposedly celebrate. We perfect the container while neglecting its purpose to create sacred space where human and divine principles might briefly intersect. This pattern represents not simply religious decline, but transformation in how Athens understands herself and her place within larger order. When rituals connecting human and divine domains become hollow performances, the fundamental orientation they once provided gradually dissolves. We maintain physical structures of temples, while the metaphysical architecture they expressed increasingly disappears from active understanding. The Parthenon stands as magnificent as ever, its proportions still embodying mathematical harmony that mirrors cosmic order. Yet our relationship to what it represents has fundamentally changed. For most Athenians, it increasingly functions as symbol of past achievement and civic identity, rather than active connection to divine wisdom. We preserve the building meticulously, while the understanding it was built to honor fades from practical consciousness. As darkness falls, I find myself contemplating Athens' spiritual trajectory alongside her political and intellectual decline. Perhaps they represent not separate developments, but integrated aspects of singular transformation. When foundational understanding of cosmic order and human purpose weakens, both intellectual and political expressions naturally lose coherence. The ceremonial forms we maintain with increasing technical skill themselves become hollow containers, architecturally perfect, but spiritually vacant. Tomorrow we will witness more ceremonies, recite more ancestral prayers, participate in more traditional observances. We will perform our cultural inheritance with impeccable accuracy, while the inner dimensions that once animated these forms continue their quiet disappearance. Like actors who have performed the same drama countless times, we know our lines perfectly while increasingly forgetting why the play itself matters. He appeared in the marketplace yesterday without invitation or announcement, a figure whose deliberate squalor itself constituted philosophical statement. Diogenes of Sinope died generations ago, but his spiritual descendants continue wandering. The Greek world, carrying his tradition of provocative simplicity into increasingly complicated times. This particular cynic, who calls himself Menippus, though I suspect this borrowed from the famous satirist, positioned himself near the statue of Solon, where respectable philosophers occasionally offer public lectures. His appearance alone ensured attention. While most philosophers maintain at least minimal grooming standards to secure audience and patrons, Menippus embraced the most extreme elements of cynic tradition: matted beard, filthy chiton with deliberate tears, a walking staff, more weapon than support, and the characteristic cynic wallet containing presumably all his worldly possessions. Most provocatively, he brought the broken remnants of an Athenian trireme's prow, salvaged perhaps from the naval yards, where decommissioned vessels slowly rot. "Gather, Athenians," he called, his voice surprisingly cultivated despite his wild appearance. "Come hear truth without ornament from a man who seeks neither your approval nor your payment." I intended merely to observe briefly while continuing to the bookseller's stall, but something in his manner suggested substance behind theatrics. The small crowd that collected expected typical cynic provocations: public indecency, mockery of social convention, perhaps rudimentary philosophy wrapped in shocking delivery. What they received proved more substantial, and consequently more disturbing. "I speak to a ghost city populated by ghost citizens," he began, gesturing expansively toward the marketplace and Acropolis beyond. "Athens died years ago, though her corpse continues performing lifelike movements. You conduct business, hold assemblies, teach philosophies, and maintain elaborate rituals, while the spirit that once animated these forms has departed for more fertile territories." Several listeners made dismissive gestures and turned away, precisely the reaction cynics deliberately provoke, filtering audiences down to those willing to endure discomfort for potential insight. I remained, along with perhaps 20 others, as Menippus warmed to his theme. "Your philosophers debate which ancient master correctly described reality, while reality itself transforms around them unexamined," he continued, tapping the broken ship's prow with his staff. "Your politicians deliver magnificent orations about Athenian power, while your military capacity rots like these abandoned vessels. Your priests perform increasingly elaborate ceremonies to gods who no longer listen, because you no longer truly speak to them." A well-dressed merchant called out the standard criticism of cynic philosophy: Easy to criticize civilization's shortcomings while contributing nothing to its maintenance. Menippus turned toward him with unexpected gentleness, rather than characteristic cynic aggression. I offer the contribution civilization most requires, yet least welcomes. Uncompensated truth separated from institutional interest. The merchant speaks truth about his wares, only until honesty threatens profit. The politician speaks truth about the city, only until candor threatens position. The philosopher speaks truth about reality only until accuracy threatens patronage. He climbed atop a low wall, gaining better visibility for his diminutive frame, his tattered garment revealing legs muscled from evident long wandering. I have walked the breadth of the Greek world over 3 years, observing from outside what participants cannot see from within. Athens maintains the appearance of intellectual preeminence, while Alexandria actually advances knowledge. You preserve the forms of democratic governance while practical power concentrates among wealthy patrons connected to foreign interests. You recite cultural achievements of previous generations while producing primarily elegant commentary upon earlier creativity. The analysis itself wasn't particularly original. Similar observations privately circulate among thoughtful Athenians. What distinguished this presentation was its complete freedom from qualification, contextualization, or concern for institutional continuity. The cynic's detachment from social consequence allowed articulation of patterns those embedded within systems necessarily approach more cautiously. Athens remains trapped between fading past and emerging future, Menippus continued, warming to his subject. You've transformed from civilization's creator to its museum curator, preserving previous achievements while generating minimal innovation yourselves. Your philosophers teach what Socrates discovered rather than employing Socratic method to question contemporary assumptions. Your politicians invoke Marathon and Salamis while surrendering strategic autonomy through diplomatic necessity. Your merchants celebrate commercial traditions while watching trade routes redirect toward more dynamic centers. I expected someone to challenge these assertions directly, but the small audience showed the particular discomfort that accompanies recognition rather than disagreement. We shifted feet, avoided eye contact, examined architectural details with sudden fascination, physical manifestations of intellectual discomfort. Menippus noted this reaction with evident satisfaction. Your discomfort itself confirms my observation. Those who confidently inhabit thriving traditions respond to criticism with vigorous counterargument. Those who secretly recognize decline but publicly deny it respond with precisely this physical discomfort, the body admitting what social convention prevents the mind from articulating. When no substantive challenge emerged, I felt peculiar obligation to engage despite my general policy of avoiding public philosophical exchange. Your analysis contains partial truth, I acknowledged, stepping forward. But decline itself represents natural historical pattern rather than moral failing. Civilizations naturally experience periods of expansion and contraction, creativity and consolidation. Athens' current phase may represent necessary digestion of earlier innovation rather than simple deterioration. Menippus studied me with unexpected perceptiveness. Aristodemus of Athens, he identified me correctly, who teaches composite philosophical systems to diminishing audiences while privately documenting the patterns I've described. Your journals contain harsher assessments than my public pronouncements, though you cloak observation in carefully balanced philosophical language that preserves institutional responsibility. His knowledge of my private writings proved unsettling. How could you possibly know the content of personal reflections? I demanded. Because genuine perception transcends individual observation, he replied enigmatically. Those willing to see clearly reach similar conclusions regardless of position or perspective. I've encountered thoughtful observers throughout declining Athens who privately recognize patterns they publicly minimize. You're merely more systematic in documenting transformation. You nevertheless help maintain through continued participation in institutional structures experiencing entropic dissolution. This exchange attracted additional listeners, creating the modest audience that typically collects when identified philosophers engage in public dialogue. Recognizing opportunity. For substantive exchange rather than mere provocation, Menippus moderated his presentation style while maintaining his essential challenge. The Cynic tradition distinguishes between natural and conventional dimensions of human experience, he explained, displaying philosophical training beneath deliberate crudeness. Athens currently maintains elaborate conventions while losing connection to natural foundations that give those conventions meaning. You perform democracy without civic vitality, philosophy without genuine inquiry, religion without authentic reverence. The forms persist while animating substance dissipates. Yet conventions themselves serve essential functions, I countered. Social institutions require continuity, which necessitates maintaining traditions even during periods of reduced vitality. Perhaps preserving forms allows eventual renewal of substance when conditions again prove favorable. Or perhaps maintaining hollow forms prevents recognition of fundamental transformation, Menippus suggested. Athens clings to identity as intellectual center, while the current of knowledge flows elsewhere, as democratic exemplar while actual governance depends increasingly on external patronage. As philosophical wellspring while producing primarily commentary on earlier discoveries. These identities themselves prevent adaptation to changed circumstances. Our exchange continued through midday, drawing varying listeners as marketplace traffic ebbed and flowed. What began as typical cynic provocation evolved into substantive examination of civilization's trajectory. The patterns visible when conventional obligations to institutional preservation temporarily suspend. Menippus displayed learning belied by his appearance, citing historical patterns, philosophical precedents, and economic analyses supporting his assessment of Athenian decline. Most significantly, he articulated connections between seemingly separate developments, linking intellectual stagnation with political dependency and spiritual emptiness as integrated aspects of civilizational trajectory rather than isolated phenomena. This perspective aligned with my private reflections while expressing connections I've hesitated to formulate explicitly given my position within institutional structures. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Menippus concluded with observation that continued resonating through evening reflection. Athens now preserves what she once created, maintaining philosophical traditions rather than extending them, celebrating democratic history while practicing oligarchic governance, recalling cultural achievement rather than generating it. This curatorial role serves valuable function, but differs fundamentally from generative position you formerly occupied. Honest recognition of this transition would allow more effective adaptation than current insistence on continuity, despite accumulating evidence of transformation. After the crowd dispersed, he approached me directly, his manner shifting from public performance to private communication. Your journals demonstrate recognition exceeding your public position, he said quietly. The philosopher's responsibility extends beyond institutional maintenance to pattern recognition regardless of personal or social comfort. Your private documentation serves valuable purpose, but eventually truth requires public articulation, however institutionally inconvenient. Before I could inquire how he knew about my private writings, he departed with characteristic cynic abruptness, leaving me with uncomfortable awareness of the gap between my documented observations and public positions. His challenge identified precisely the tension I've experienced with increasing intensity, balancing institutional responsibility against intellectual integrity as evidence of fundamental transformation accumulates. The Cynic tradition serves essential function within intellectual ecology precisely through deliberate institutional detachment. By rejecting social position, material comfort, and professional affiliation, figures like Menippus gain freedom to articulate patterns those embedded within systems necessarily approach more cautiously. Their provocations create uncomfortable space where conventional constraints on perception temporarily suspend, allowing recognition of development's institutional position otherwise obscures. Walking home through evening streets, I found myself reconsidering my own carefully balanced public positions against my private documentation of Athens' trajectory. Perhaps philosophical responsibility during periods of fundamental transition differs from obligations during stable continuation. When civilizational patterns themselves transform, integrity may require acknowledging observed developments, even when institutional position creates incentives for minimizing their significance. Tomorrow, Menippus will presumably continue his provocation elsewhere, moving through the Greek world, delivering uncomfortable observations wrapped in deliberately shocking presentation. His appearance constitutes both philosophical challenge and social safety valve, allowing momentary articulation of recognized patterns, while his deliberate marginality permits dismissal of his insights as cynic exaggeration rather than accurate perception requiring institutional response. Yet truth sometimes arrives through unexpected messengers, wisdom occasionally wrapped in uncomfortable packaging. The cynic's withdrawal from social convention creates freedom to perceive patterns. Those embedded within systems necessarily approach more cautiously. His observations aligned disturbingly with my private documentation, while expressing connections I've hesitated to formulate explicitly. Perhaps wisdom sometimes requires dirty feet and institutional detachment to perceive clearly what position and responsibility otherwise obscure. I dined last evening at Lysander's home, a gathering ostensibly to honor the visiting Egyptian mathematician Euclides, though like most Athenian social occasions, its actual purpose layered several strata beneath its stated one. Lysander cultivates influential connections across faction lines, positioning himself advantageously regardless of political fluctuations. His symposia bring together figures who might otherwise never directly converse, creating exchanges impossible in more public forums. The evening's most intriguing presence was neither Euclides nor any of the assembled aristocrats, politicians, and intellectuals, but Thais, the most celebrated hetera in Athens for nearly a decade. Unlike common pornai who sell physical transactions, or even the musical flute girls who typically entertain at symposia, Thais commands fees that exceed most philosophers' annual incomes for her combination of intellectual conversation, cultural refinement, and legendary beauty. I had encountered her only distantly at public festivals, knowing her primarily through reputation rather than direct observation. Philosophical tradition typically dismisses courtesans as irrelevant to serious discourse, though Socrates himself reportedly conversed with Aspasia as intellectual equal rather than mere object of desire. This traditional boundary between respectable and disreputable wisdom increasingly strikes me as yet another conventional distinction that obscures rather than illuminates understanding. Lysander seated me directly across from Thais, an arrangement unlikely to be accidental given his meticulous attention to symposium choreography. She reclined with practiced elegance, her appearance carefully calibrated to suggest sophisticated sensuality without overt display. What immediately struck me was the quality of her attention, an observational acuity I've encountered rarely even among dedicated philosophers. She watched conversations with particular intensity, noting not merely words but subtle physical responses, momentary eye movements, unconscious gestures, the physical subtext that often contradicts verbal presentation. Initially, she participated minimally in general discussion, offering occasional observations that blended wit with unexpected insight. As wine loosened conventional barriers, she engaged more directly, revealing education rivaling most aristocratic Athenian women and exceeding many men present. Her references ranged comfortably through Homer, Herodotus, Euripides, and even contemporary philosophical debates, knowledge acquired not through formal academy training but through thousands of private conversations with Athens' most influential men. Your profession offers unusual perspective on Athenian leadership, I observed, during a momentary break in general conversation. You witness these men with masks lowered, rather than carefully positioned. Her smile acknowledged the observations Accuracy while suggesting my formulation remained incomplete. More specifically, she corrected gently, I witnessed the gap between public presentation and private reality. Men speak differently when pursuing pleasure than when seeking power, revealing truths in intimate settings they carefully conceal in public discourse. And what truths have you observed that might interest a philosopher? I inquired. That Athens is governed increasingly by men who no longer believe their own public pronouncements, she replied without hesitation. They proclaim cultural superiority, while privately acknowledging our creative decline. They assert political independence while privately calculating which external patron offers greatest advantage. They publicly maintain traditions they privately consider obsolete. Her assessment echoed my own observations with discomforting precision. Before I could inquire further, general conversation shifted toward Athenian dramatic festivals, with several politicians lamenting declining quality of contemporary productions compared to previous generations. Strange how each generation perceives immediately preceding ones as representing peak achievement while dismissing contemporary production as degenerate. Thais interjected with subtle challenge beneath polite delivery. Yet this pattern itself might reveal more about observers than about objective cultural conditions. You suggest our assessment of decline reflects perception rather than reality? Asked Apollodorus, a minor politician known for cultural conservatism. I suggest, she responded carefully, that cultures naturally transform rather than simply advance or decline. What appears as deterioration often represents adaptation to changed conditions, rather than simple failure of creativity or commitment. Her perspective aligned with my own private reflections, while expressing directly what I've approached more cautiously in public discourse. When conversation temporarily clustered into smaller exchanges, I returned to our previous discussion. You've observed our leadership class intimately for years, I noted. Has their character fundamentally changed, or merely their circumstances? Both transform simultaneously, she replied. 15 years ago, Athenian leaders still believed sincerely in our special destiny, our cultural superiority, political significance, philosophical preeminence. They acted from genuine conviction, even when behaving hypocritically. Today's leaders maintain these assertions while privately harboring significant doubts about their accuracy. The result is performances increasingly detached from authentic belief. And you perceive this transformation through? I let the question hang deliberately incomplete. Through 1,000 small betrayals of conviction, she explained. Through the particular tone men use when discussing Athens' future after sufficient wine dissolves public presentation. Through careful attention to which topics produce genuine animation rather than rehearsed enthusiasm. Through observing where they invest personal resources versus where they direct public expenditure. She paused, considering whether to continue, then added, most revealingly through what they wish their sons to study and where they send them for education. Men who genuinely believe in Athens' continued intellectual preeminence educate their heirs here. Those who merely proclaim this belief increasingly send them to Alexandria, Rhodes, or even Rome. This observation struck with particular force, as I've noted similar patterns among my own students' families. The sons of Athens' most influential families increasingly complete basic education here before departing for advanced training elsewhere, suggesting their father's private assessment differs significantly from public pronouncements about Athenian excellence. As the evening progressed, I observed Thais's interaction with other guests, her chameleon-like ability to adapt presentation to each conversational partner, while maintaining consistent underlying perception. With the Egyptian mathematician, she discussed Alexandrian innovations with genuine curiosity. With conservative politicians, she presented traditional perspectives with appropriate deference. With merchants, she showed sophisticated understanding of commercial developments throughout the Mediterranean. This adaptive skill itself represents cultivated necessity within her profession. Successful hetaerae must provide each client his particular desired experience while maintaining their own internal coherence. The resulting perspective combines unusual detachment with intimate engagement, simultaneously participating in Athenian society, while maintaining outsiders' analytical distance. When most guests had departed or succumbed to wine's influence, I found myself in final conversation with Thais and Lysander himself. With social performance requirements diminished, she spoke more directly about patterns she's observed through years receiving confidences from Athens' most powerful men. The transformation occurs through predictable stages, she explained. First, public confidence with private doubt, maintaining traditional assertions while privately questioning their continued accuracy. Next, public assertion with private abandonment, claiming Athenian superiority while personally hedging through investments and connections elsewhere. Finally, public performance without even private pretense of belief, participating in institutional rituals while accepting their hollow nature as simply how things are done. And Athens' leadership currently occupies which stage? Lysander inquired with the particular attentiveness he reserves for practically useful information. The transition between second and third, she replied without hesitation. Most still maintain the appearance of believing traditional narratives while privately arranging alternatives. But increasingly, even private pretense fades. They perform expected roles with decreasing conviction that fundamental renewal remains possible. Yet they continue participating in institutions they no longer fully trust, I observed. Of course, she nodded. Because institutional position still confers practical advantages, even when its legitimizing narrative weakens. Men maintain traditional offices, conduct traditional ceremonies, and deliver traditional pronouncements because these activities still distribute material resources and social privilege, regardless of their connection to originally animating principles. Her analysis cut uncomfortably close to patterns I've observed in philosophical institutions. Continuing traditional practices increasingly detached from their original purposes, maintaining positions whose legitimacy derives from principles we no longer fully embrace. The external forms persist while internal conviction gradually hollows. Before departing, Thais offered observation that has remained with me through today's reflection. The courtesan and philosopher share unusual perspective. We observe intimately while remaining fundamentally apart, participating while maintaining analytical distance. We witness confessions rarely offered in public discourse. The difference lies in our response. You document patterns for future understanding. I utilize them for present advantage. Her self-awareness proved more sophisticated than many philosophers I've encountered, her perception sharpened by professional necessity rather than theoretical training. The hetera's position, embedded within society while fundamentally excluded from respectable participation, creates perspective impossible for those fully integrated into conventional structures. Like the cynic philosopher who deliberately stands outside social norms, the courtesan's marginal position enables clearer perception of patterns that conventional participation naturally obscures. Walking home through pre-dawn streets, I found myself considering how different vantage points reveal different aspects of Athens' transformation. The admiral sees military capacity hollowing beneath maintained appearance. The courtesan observes leadership's declining private conviction behind continued public performance. The cynic perceives institutional continuity disguising functional deterioration. Each perspective illuminates aspects that others might miss, creating composite understanding impossible from single vantage point. Perhaps comprehensive wisdom requires integrating observations from positions normally considered separate, combining the courtesan's intimate understanding of private motivation, the admiral's practical assessment of capacity versus appearance, the cynic's freedom from institutional attachment, and the philosopher's systematic analysis. Each perspective reveals patterns that conventional participation naturally obscures, creating composite understanding impossible from traditional philosophical position alone. The hetaira studies men as I study arguments, noting contradictions between stated principles and actual behaviors, observing gaps between public assertion and private doubt, recognizing patterns that participants themselves often miss. Her wisdom emerges not despite her profession but because of it. Her marginal position creating clarity impossible for those embedded within conventional structures. Perhaps true understanding requires precisely this integration of perspectives, traditionally kept separate by conventional boundaries that increasingly appear as arbitrary limitations rather than natural distinctions. I discovered an unfamiliar shrine today in a neighborhood near the Western Gate. A modest structure that would have escaped notice entirely had a small gathering not drawn my attention. The building itself bore no distinctive architectural features, announcing its purpose, appearing as ordinary residence rather than sacred space. Only the small crowd entering with particular reverence suggested its function. Curiosity drew me closer. Several worshippers carried small offerings, flowers, bread, modest libations, while others simply approached with empty hands but evident anticipation. When the door opened to admit them, I glimpsed an interior, arranged nothing like traditional Athenian temples. No statue occupied central position. Instead, an altar bearing curious symbols stood before a wall painted with astronomical imagery. Stars, planets, and unfamiliar zodiacal representations. The Temple of Serapis welcomes all seekers, offered a young man who noticed my observation, gesturing toward the entrance with genuine warmth. The evening devotion begins shortly, if you wish to participate. Serapis, the Egyptian deity created through Ptolemy's deliberate syncretism, combining elements of Osiris, Apis, Zeus, Helios, and Dionysus into single divinity designed to unify Greek and Egyptian subjects. I had read scholarly accounts of this theological innovation, but hadn't realized the cult had established physical presence in Athens itself. Professional curiosity overcame traditional reservation. Inside, perhaps 40 worshippers arranged themselves in concentric circles around the central altar, where a priest in white robes bearing both Egyptian and Greek decorative elements prepared ritual implements. The space smelled of unfamiliar incense, not the traditional frankincense or myrrh of Greek ceremonies, but something more complex and exotic. "Many attend their first ceremony with uncertainty," whispered a middle-aged woman beside me, noting my hesitation. "Simply observe if you prefer. The rites require no participation until you choose engagement." The service itself proved fascinating. Elements of Greek religious practice blended seamlessly with Egyptian ritual movements, creating ceremony simultaneously familiar and foreign. Most striking was the congregation's evident emotional investment. Unlike traditional Athenian temple observances where participants often display respectful detachment, these worshippers exhibited genuine spiritual absorption following proceedings, with intense focus that suggested authentic connection rather than mere social obligation. Afterwards, I conversed with several attendees, discovering demographic patterns that illuminate broader religious transitions occurring throughout Athens. Many were immigrants, Egyptian merchants, Syrian craftsmen, Persian scholars. But at least half appeared to be native Athenians, including several from reasonably prominent families. Their explanations for participation revealed consistent themes. Traditional ceremonies maintain proper form but seem increasingly empty, explained Theodorus, a shipwright whose family has constructed vessels in Piraeus for generations. The priest recites correct phrases and performs proper movements, but nothing happens. Here, something happens. I cannot explain precisely what, but I leave different than I arrived. The traditional gods remain trapped in ancient stories, offered Lydia, a weaver whose workshop produces textiles for wealthy households. Serapis responds to present conditions, offering wisdom for navigating current circumstances, rather than merely repeating patterns established in mythological time. Most revealing was my conversation with Nikon, whom I recognized as belonging to a long-established Athenian family with significant property holdings. His grandfather served as archon. His father maintains traditional religious observances with public rigor. Finding him in this unconventional setting suggested religious transformation, reaching beyond marginal populations into Athens' established core. I maintain appearances at traditional ceremonies, he acknowledged, when I expressed surprise at his presence. My position requires public participation in established observances. But those rituals increasingly resemble theatrical performances. We conduct for each other rather than genuine communion with divine presence. Here, beneath less impressive exterior, I encounter something that feels authentic rather than merely habitual. Walking home, I noted 3 similar gatherings in districts formerly dedicated exclusively to traditional worship. Modest structures where followers of Cybele, Mithras, and Isis conduct ceremonies combining elements from multiple religious traditions. These syncretic practices integrate Greek philosophical concepts with Egyptian ritual precision, Persian cosmological frameworks, and Syrian emotional expressiveness, creating religious experiences that transcend traditional boundaries. This religious diversification extends beyond imported deities to transformations within Hellenic tradition itself. The Orphic mysteries, once considered marginal compared to established Olympian worship, attract increasing participation among Athenians disillusioned with conventional observances. Their emphasis on personal transformation through direct divine encounter rather than civic ritual participation aligns with broader patterns of religious evolution throughout the Mediterranean. Most significantly, these emerging religious forms share characteristics that traditional Athenian worship increasingly lacks. They emphasize personal experience over public observance, direct divine encounter over ceremonial correctness, individual transformation over collective obligation. They address current conditions rather than merely preserving ancestral patterns, offering frameworks for navigating present circumstances rather than simply maintaining connections to mythological past. This afternoon I discussed these observations with Clenthes during our regular philosophical dialogue, curious how a committed Stoic might interpret such religious diversification. His perspective proved more nuanced than his typically conservative position suggested. The gods themselves remain constant, he proposed, but human modes of accessing divine wisdom naturally evolve with changing conditions. Traditional forms served Athens during her ascendancy, creating civic cohesion and collective identity necessary for her development. As circumstances transform, religious expression naturally adapts to address different human needs. You suggest these new forms represent evolution rather than degradation? I asked. Neither term captures the process accurately, he replied after consideration. Religious expressions expand and contract like breathing, sometimes emphasizing collective civic identity, other times focusing on individual spiritual experience. Neither approach represents absolute advancement or decline, merely appropriate response to different historical circumstances. This interpretation offers useful framework for understanding Athens' changing religious landscape. Traditional civic worship flourished during periods of political independence and collective confidence, creating shared identity essential for democratic participation. As these conditions weaken, religious expression naturally shifts toward forms addressing individual meaning within changing circumstances rather than reinforcing collective identity, increasingly disconnected from practical reality. What appears as religious decline from institutional perspective might represent necessary adaptation from spiritual one. As traditional structures hollow through historical transformation, authentic religious impulse naturally seeks new vessels, rather than continuing to animate increasingly empty forms. The gods haven't abandoned Athens so much as changed their mode of communication as circumstances evolve. The contrast between traditional observances and emerging practices became particularly evident during yesterday's festival honoring Athena Polias. The official ceremony proceeded with impeccable adherence to established protocol. Appropriate officials performing prescribed rituals using traditional implements while reciting ancient formulas without error. The technical execution appeared flawless, while spiritual engagement seemed minimal. Participants focused primarily on performing roles correctly rather than experiencing divine presence. That same evening, I passed a small gathering near the Ilissos River where followers of Dionysus conducted simplified yet emotionally potent worship. Their ceremony lacked elaborate equipment or architectural grandeur, utilizing minimal resources while generating palpable spiritual intensity. Participants displayed authentic absorption rather than dutiful compliance, creating impression of genuine religious experience rather than mere performative obligation. This pattern repeats throughout Athens. Magnificent traditional structures hosting increasingly hollow observances, while modest alternative spaces shelter authentic spiritual engagement. The religious impulse hasn't disappeared but redirected, flowing naturally toward forms that accommodate changing conditions rather than remaining confined within traditions disconnected from current reality. Most established intellectual and political figures publicly maintain traditional observances while privately exploring alternative approaches. Lycurgus, who serves as priest of Poseidon through hereditary appointment, performs official duties with meticulous correctness, while reportedly participating in Mithraic ceremonies, offering more personally meaningful engagement. This religious compartmentalization, public maintenance of traditional forms alongside private pursuit of alternative practices, mirrors broader patterns of Athenian institutional behavior. The foreign gods ascend not through conquest but invitation, filling spiritual vacuums created as traditional observances gradually hollow. They arrive not as hostile replacements, but as welcomed alternatives, addressing needs that established practices increasingly fail to meet. Their rising presence represents not so much victory over traditional deities as evolution in how divine wisdom manifests through changing historical circumstances. Perhaps most significantly, these emerging religious forms transcend traditional boundaries between Hellenic and barbarian traditions, creating syncretic practices that integrate elements from multiple cultural sources. The Serapis cult deliberately combines Greek and Egyptian elements. Mithric mysteries integrate Persian cosmology with Greek philosophical frameworks. Orphic practices incorporate Thracian emotional expressiveness within Hellenic mythological structure. This religious integration parallels broader Mediterranean cultural synthesis, occurring as formerly distinct traditions increasingly intermingle. As I documented these observations this evening, a passage from Heraclitus returned to mind. The only constant is change. Traditional religious structures, like political institutions and philosophical frameworks, naturally transform as historical circumstances evolve. What appears as decline from perspective of institutional continuity might represent necessary adaptation from viewpoint of spiritual authenticity. The gods speak differently as human conditions change, maintaining essential connection through evolving forms rather than fixed structures. The philosopher's task includes documenting such transitions without simplistic judgment, neither romanticizing traditional forms nor uncritically embracing alternatives, but recognizing how religious expression necessarily evolves as historical circumstances transform. The gods haven't abandoned Athens. They simply speak through different voices as the city's position and needs change. Numbers speak with peculiar eloquence once one learns their language. Unlike words that bend to rhetorical purpose or philosophical concepts that accommodate multiple interpretations, mathematical patterns maintain stubborn integrity regardless of our wishes. Perhaps this explains why I've hesitated to fully engage with the numerical evidence of Athens's transformation. Figures offer fewer comfortable ambiguities than philosophical analysis, fewer places to hide from uncomfortable conclusions. Yesterday, I spent morning hours with a Chaikos, who serves as public accountant overseeing the city's financial records. Our relationship dates to student days, though our paths diverged. He toward practical mathematics, while I pursued theoretical philosophy. His position grants access to 3 decades of economic data normally unavailable to those outside administrative circles. My requested visit carried scholarly pretext, but we both recognized my deeper purpose. You seek numerical confirmation of what you've observed through other means, he suggested, as we settled in his modest office surrounded by carefully organized scrolls, Philosophy approaches truth through concepts. Mathematics arrives through quantities. Both paths should reach similar destinations if properly followed. His systematic presentation transformed vague impressions into concrete patterns impossible to dismiss through rhetorical qualification. The first scrolls detailed Athens' shipping volume over 25 years, not estimates or projections, but precise figures recorded for taxation purposes. The decline appeared not as dramatic collapse, but as steady erosion. 23% reduction in total merchant vessels using Piraeus. 37% decrease in tonnage shipped. 44% fewer trading partnerships with eastern ports. Consider these figures against population estimates, Achaikos suggested, unrolling another document covered with careful tabulations. Athens maintains approximately 87% of her population from 30 years ago, yet commercial activity has contracted more dramatically. The discrepancy reveals declining prosperity per citizen rather than simple population reduction. Most revealing were comparative statistics between Athens and emerging commercial centers. While our shipping volume decreased steadily, Rhodes increased its commercial traffic by 62% during the same period. Alexandria's growth exceeded 120%, albeit from a more recent starting point. Even smaller commercial centers like Byzantium and Corinth showed significant expansion while Athens contracted. The pattern becomes clearer when examining specialized industries, Achaikos continued. Sectors where Athens traditionally excelled show particularly pronounced decline. Premium pottery exports decreased 67%, silver-worked luxury items 74%. Our specialized artisans increasingly relocate to more dynamic centers, taking their skills where demand and compensation remain robust. Financial measurements extended beyond commerce to intellectual production. Achaikos maintains personal records, tracking patronage patterns among wealthy supporters of philosophical schools. The data showed steady redistribution of resources, declining local investment in Athenian institutions alongside increasing support for educational activities elsewhere, particularly Alexandria. The wealthy vote with their drachmas, he observed, indicating figures showing dramatic increase in Athenian families funding positions at the Alexandrian Mouseion. They maintain public support for local institutions while privately directing resources toward what they perceive as more valuable intellectual investments abroad. Military accounting provided equally unambiguous evidence. Records tracking naval expenditure against vessel readiness revealed particularly troubling divergence. Maintenance costs increased by approximately 40% over 15 years, while the number of combat-ready vessels declined by nearly 60%. Athens pays substantially more to maintain significantly less capability. The mathematical definition of systemic inefficiency. Administrative costs consume increasing resources, Achaikos explained, highlighting relevant calculations. 30 years ago, approximately 12% of naval appropriations funded oversight bureaucracy. Today, that figure approaches 31%, leaving proportionally less for actual ships, crews, and operations. This pattern repeated across multiple sectors, increasing expenditure on administrative structures alongside declining production of goods, services, or capabilities those structures supposedly support. The mathematical pattern reveals institutional entropy more precisely than philosophical analysis ever could. Systems gradually redirecting resources toward self-maintenance rather than original purpose. Most definitively, Achaikos presented comparative economic data from major Mediterranean centers, calculating what mathematicians call trajectory projection, the mathematical extension of current trends into likely future conditions. These calculations suggested Athens's relative economic position would continue declining at accelerating rate unless fundamental patterns changed. Mathematics cannot predict specific events, he cautioned, but reveals momentum within systems. These trajectories incorporate multiple variables: economic productivity, demographic patterns, resource allocation, competitive positioning. The resulting projections show Athens continuing to lose relative position regardless of minor policy adjustments. After reviewing dozens of carefully maintained records, we paused for wine diluted more generously than symposium standards. Achaikos's precise mind extends to appropriate midday refreshment proportions. The numerical evidence had transformed vague impressions into concrete patterns impossible to dismiss through rhetorical qualification. The financial records tell clear story, he summarized, but one seldom acknowledged in public discourse. Athens increasingly bears costs of institutional structures established during greater prosperity, while producing decreasing value through those structures. We maintain administrative systems designed for imperial management without imperial resources to sustain them. The mathematical perspective clarified patterns I'd observed through other means, but struggled to articulate precisely. Numbers provided concrete framework for understanding systemic, rather than merely circumstantial, challenges. The issue wasn't simply reduced trade or declining patronage, but fundamental misalignment between institutional structures and available resources to sustain them. Philosophy seeks wisdom, while mathematics demonstrates inevitability, Achaikosi observed as we concluded our review. Your philosophical inquiries explore how Athens might understand her transformation. These calculations show that transformation proceeding regardless of our understanding or preference. After departing his office, I encountered another mathematical perspective, this one delivered through unlikely messenger. Aristarchos of Samos, renowned astronomer visiting Athens briefly, had established temporary workspace near the Agora, where he demonstrated celestial calculations to interested observers. His astronomical work, building upon Alexandrian methods, proposes heliocentric model that positions Sun rather than Earth at cosmic center. Mathematical patterns reveal truth regardless of philosophical preference, he explained to gathered listeners. We naturally place ourselves at center of cosmic understanding, just as Athens places herself at center of cultural universe. Yet calculations increasingly suggest different arrangement, one where neither Earth nor Athens occupies central position. His astronomical observations provided metaphorical parallel to Achaikos' economic calculations. Both utilize mathematical reasoning to reveal patterns that contradict preferred narratives. Earth's central cosmic position in one case, Athens' continued cultural centrality in the other. Both demonstrate how numerical analysis can undermine comfortable assumptions more efficiently than philosophical argumentation. Resistance to mathematical conclusions reveals psychological rather than logical processes, Aristarchos suggested, when I questioned him privately after his demonstration. When calculations contradict preferred narratives, most respond by questioning the calculations rather than adjusting narratives. Yet mathematics proceeds with inevitable precision regardless of our preference or protest. This mathematical perspective illuminates patterns throughout Athenian society. As evidence of diminishing position accumulates, responses divide between those who adjust understanding based on demonstrated patterns and those who maintain preferred narratives by questioning methodology, contextualizing data, or simply ignoring quantitative evidence entirely. Mathematical clarity thus reveals not just external circumstances but internal resistance to recognizing them. Later that evening, I attended a council meeting where budget allocations for coming year were debated. The discussion perfectly illustrated this division. Those responsible for financial oversight presented clear figures showing unsustainable trajectories. Expenses exceeding revenues, maintenance requirements, outpacing available resources, compensation demands increasing while productivity measures declined. Their mathematical demonstration left minimal room for interpretation. Yet subsequent debate largely avoided engaging these numerical realities. Speakers offered rhetorical frameworks that acknowledged challenges while avoiding their implications, proposed minor adjustments to fundamentally unbalanced systems, or redirected discussion toward abstract principles rather than concrete figures. The mathematical clarity presented at the beginning gradually dissolved into comfortable ambiguity, more conducive to maintaining institutional continuity. Numbers confine imagination within reality's boundaries, observed Demetrios, a mathematician, friend who attended the council meeting with me. Political discourse naturally resists such confinement, preferring spaces where rhetorical skill can construct alternative interpretations. Mathematics constrains such creativity too severely for comfortable governance. This observation illuminates why mathematical evidence often proves less persuasive than its precision should warrant. Numerical patterns map reality with uncomfortable clarity, restricting rhetorical maneuverability necessary for institutional maintenance during decline. Political processes naturally favor approaches that preserve flexibility through conceptual ambiguity rather than confronting mathematical certainty. As evening deepened into night, I reviewed both sets of calculations, Achaikos's economic figures and Aristarchos's astronomical measurements. Though addressing different subjects, both demonstrate how mathematical analysis reveals patterns that philosophical discourse often obscures. Numbers speak truth with particular clarity precisely because they resist rhetorical manipulation that allows comfortable self-deception. The mathematical evidence transforms vague impression into documented pattern. Athens maintains institutional structures established during greater prosperity, while those structures consume increasing resources to produce diminishing returns. This fundamental misalignment between organizational requirements and available resources creates mathematical certainty of continued decline, regardless of minor policy adjustments or rhetorical reframing. Perhaps most significantly, mathematical perspective shifts focus from moral to mechanical factors. Athens's transformation emerges not primarily from character failure, cultural degradation, or moral decline, but from calculable patterns within complex systems, resource constraints, institutional entropy, competitive disadvantages, demographic trends. Mathematical analysis reveals not who deserves blame, but which mechanisms generate observed outcomes. As I prepare for sleep, these numerical patterns continue organizing my understanding more precisely than philosophical frameworks alone could accomplish. The philosopher seeks wisdom that might guide response to changing circumstances. The mathematician demonstrates patterns proceeding regardless of our response. Together, these perspectives perhaps offer most complete understanding, recognition of inevitable transformations alongside wisdom for navigating them with minimal unnecessary suffering.